Chapter 1675. When Danny heard this, his expression shook and he said, "Oh, there's such a thing? Looks like our human path shouldn't be broken." Then, his voice lowered slightly, "But this matter should be treated with caution. May I know where the treasure is now?" With just a thought, a banner floated out from Zhang Yan's sleeves. When the banner unfurled, auspicious clouds gathered and floated to the left and right. It looked like it was wrapped in celestial fog, full of spiritual energy. Usually, this kind of treasure didn't need to be refined and could be used. But because it had its own consciousness, it wasn't easy to use it according to one's will. But with the elephant dragon golden furnace, as long as he walked around it, he could refine the impurities and return it to its original state. Michihito Ichido told the servant, "Go and invite fellow Taoist Gu out." The servant bowed, turned around, and went back inside. Danny looked at the god-slaying heavenly banner for a while and said, "This treasure's chi is pure, without any impurities. This means that since it was refined, no one has been its owner. And it was refined before the great change in Busu heaven." Michihito Ichido was surprised. "No owner? That's strange. In your opinion, could this be the doing of the Xiantian demons?" He had examined it before and could not find any connection with demons or evil spirits on it. However, it did not have the original owner, which was indeed a little strange. He had no choice but to ask again. As long as there was a chance, he would rather abandon it than take the risk. Danny thought for a while and said slowly, "As for whether it was used by the demons or not, in my opinion, it's not very possible. Because the method of building the treasure in Busu heaven and even the materials are in the hands of our human path cultivators. Even if they had a plan, they couldn't refine it privately." At this point, he smiled and said, "Even if it can be refined, it will be used to protect one's life. Why wouldn't it be refined? Aren't they afraid that it will be taken away? You have to know that although the demonic powers were gradually rising, they were still below the human Tao. Only our generation of human cultivators, many of whom had 1 or 2 enchanted artifacts with them, would be so generous and not use them." Michihito Ichido nodded slowly and said, "That makes sense." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Just now when I was inspecting the cave, I saw that this treasure was crystal clear inside and out, without any tampering. Now that it's in our hands, even the original owner can forget about taking it back. Even if it was really refined by the demon, it's just a gift to us." Hearing this, Michihito Ichido finally dispelled the worries in his heart. At this moment, the sound of footsteps could be heard. It was Gu Tuo. When he saw the 3 of them standing here, he was startled and didn't dare to get too close. He bowed and said, "This lowly one greets the 3 high reverends." However, he still had some doubts in his heart. The human Dao Yuanzun was famous, and he had heard of most of them, but Zhang Yan and Dan didn't seem to match up with the great existences in the legends. He thought, when I came out, the Venerables said that the human Dao Yuanzun has long lost interest in fighting for Bushutian and planned to retreat and hide. But now I know that this is not the case. Due to his personality, he didn't have any opinion on either side and only wanted to cultivate in peace. But at the same time, he understood that when the great existences fought, if the people below did not have protection, it would be an extravagant hope for them to keep their lives. Michihito Ichido told Gu Tuo to dispense with the formalities and told Dan Yi about his situation. Dan Yi looked at Gu Tuo and calculated for a while before using his divine will to communicate. "This Taoist friend cultivates the orthodox cultivation method of our human Tao. At least for the past 1,000,000 years, he hasn't had any contact with the innate demons, so there shouldn't be any problem." The contact mentioned here didn't mean talking face to face, but having some kind of relationship with them. Even sending someone to deliver an order, or even sending a letter to communicate with the divine will could be counted as part of this. Michihito Ichido saw that Gu Tuo's judgment was the same as his and Zhang Yan's, so he knew that there was no problem with this person. At this moment, Zhang Yan said, "Taoist friend Dan Yi can see that this person hasn't had any contact with the innate demons. Is this because of a secret technique or is there something else?" Danny replied, "Taoist friend Zhang has never seen those innate demons. They aren't transformed from any birds or beasts, but from a strand of innate spirit. Their appearance can change in all kinds of ways, and their chi dynamic is especially unique. The junior disciples who have had contact with them will inevitably be invaded by their chi dynamic. After that, he turned his head and asked Gu Tuo, "Just now, you said that there are many monster cultivators in Busha Heaven?" Gu Tuo replied, "Yes, only those people with natural endowment that's 1 in a million can enter. Ordinary demon cultivators can only be rejected." Dan Yi, on the other hand, was deep in thought. Michihito Ichido waved his hand, signaling Gu Tuo to leave. He asked, "Taoist friend, did you think of something?" Danny said, "I was thinking if I can also send people into Busha Heaven to investigate the situation of the demon." Michihito Ichido frowned and shook his head. "That is almost impossible." It wasn't that he didn't think about it. Now that they were at a disadvantage because they didn't know the inside story of Busha Heaven, they could only make their own guesses. It would be best if they could understand it, but it was too difficult to do it. Just like how the innate demons couldn't deceive them, they couldn't deceive this junior either. Moreover, to enter the forbidden formation and carry out the secret, the candidates could only be chosen from the lower realm cultivators. Because this junior's cultivation was too low, even if he could enter, he wouldn't be able to find anything. Zhang Yan's heart skipped a beat. Danny must have thought of this before. Now that he brought it up, there might be a chance. He asked, "Taoist friend, did you gain anything from this trip?" Danny didn't hide anything and said, "Fellow Taoist has guessed correctly. I didn't manage to find those 2 fellow Taoists this time, but I did discover something else. I obtained a secret art from that cave. If I use it properly, I might be able to fool those demons. It's just that I have yet to fully comprehend it, so I hope the 2 of you can take a look." He flipped his palm and a jade scroll flew out. It floated in front of the 2. Zhang Yan's gaze landed on it and a mysterious feeling floated in his heart. There were no words inside, only thoughts. However, it was different from the Patriarch Master's, which was vague and unfathomable. Here, it was clear that the creator of the technique was at the same cultivation level as him. He observed for a moment and then commented, "Unconventional." Michihito Ichido frowned slightly and said, "It's possible, but that's all. It's very difficult to succeed." Danny looked up and said, "But it's not impossible." Michihito Ichido thought about it and nodded in agreement. He was able to discern that if this technique was to be used, then it could only be used to investigate one's peers. Exactly why the 2 of them created this technique and exactly who they wanted to investigate was something that he had no way of knowing. However, it was better to think about how to deal with those demons than to pursue this matter. Zhang Yan was also thinking about it. If it was the normal way, sending people to Bu Su Tian wouldn't work, but this technique could make use of the incarnations of others to spy on them. For example, if he wanted to spy on Bu Su Tian, he could start with the incarnations of the demons. After thinking about it, he said, "We can give it a try." Even if he failed, he wouldn't lose anything. But if he succeeded, he might be able to learn some important information. In a deep voice, Taoisti said, "This technique is only a rough deduction. There are many details that are not explained in detail. We need to reorganize them." Danny said, "At least the direction has been pointed out. With the 3 of us here, we can think of a way." Taoist E shook his head and said, "Fellow Taoist, you should be able to tell that in order to successfully cast this spell, one's vitality must be stronger than the innate demon. Not only that, one must be able to completely overwhelm him, just like how he is able to overturn the sky." He looked at Zhang Yan and said, "Among all the people I've seen in my life, Taoist Zhang has the strongest Yuan Qi. However, I'm afraid that even Taoist Zhang can't achieve this by himself." Dan Yi said decisively, "Then let's find more people. If the 3 of us are not enough, we can find Taoist Mo Tsang and the others. I believe that after they know about this, they will also help." Michihito Ichido waved his hand and said, "It's not that simple. With many people working together, rivers can form an ocean. However, rivers come from different sources. It's inevitable that there will be impurities. The chi dynamic won't be pure, and it will be easily detected." He held the jade scroll in his hand and said, Back then, the two fellow Taoists completed this technique because they didn't know how to continue. Dan Yi didn't refute because he also knew. This was the most contradictory point. To successfully execute the dermic formulation, several people would need to work together. However, the more people involved, the more contaminants there would be. Even if they managed to sneak in, the connate fiendish demons would only need to investigate and they would be exposed. Zhang Yan thought for a moment and said, "You too, maybe we don't have to do this." Dan Yi turned his head and said, "Taoist friend, do you have any good ideas?" Zhang Yan smiled and said, "I can't say that I have any good ideas. I used the demon incarnation to sneak into Bu Su Tian to understand the situation. As long as we can enter this world, we don't need to care about the time. Even if we can only make contact with this person for a moment, it will be enough." Actually, there was no need for them to understand so much. They only needed to know if the connate demons were taming the treasure as they had guessed. They only needed to pay attention to it for a moment. Then, even if the incarnation was discovered immediately, it would not be a problem. Dan Yi was startled for a moment before regaining his composure. He nodded repeatedly and said, "That's right, we were too greedy before, making it extremely difficult to succeed. If we follow fellow Taoists' method, our chances of success will greatly increase." Michihito Ichido pondered for a moment and agreed, Taoist Zhang's method is feasible. Dan Yi became spirited and said, "There's no time to lose. I will bring this jade scroll to see Taoist Emotsang and the others and ask them to help us. With the combined power of the people Tao, we should be able to succeed." Zhang Yan saw that he was about to leave but stopped him and said, "Taoist friend, have you refined the strange qi?" Dan Yi said, "Not yet." Zhang Yan said, "This matter can't be delayed either. How about this? You can hand over the refining method to Taoist I and Taoist Yi. There will be no delay." Dan Yi thought about it and felt that it was fine. This matter wasn't something that could be done with just a thought incarnation. He shook his sleeves and the strange qi scattered out. After Zhang Yan took it, he transmitted his thoughts through his spirit will. He then cupped his hands and said, "I will leave this matter to the two of you." Chapter 1676. After the two of them sent Dan Yi away, they began to prepare for the sacrificial refinement of the strange qi. Zhang Yan said, "This treasure qi is extraordinary. I need to come here personally to sacrificial refine it. I'm afraid that the ordinary boundary will not be small. Fellow Taoist Yi, do you have a suitable place?" Michito Ichido thought for a while and said, "There is such a boundary. Fellow Taoist, please come with me." As soon as he turned around, a deep valley appeared in front of him, as if another boundary had been moved to the front. Then he raised his hand and made an inviting gesture, then turned around and walked there. Zhang Yan followed him into the valley. In front of him was a slope covered with vines, and there was a flight of stairs about 10 feet wide on the mountain ridge. His gaze followed it all the way and gradually lifted up until it reached the sky. However, both of them had supernatural powers. After taking a few steps up, they arrived above the thick cloud curtain. Zhang Yan looked down and saw that the entire continent was a huge heavenly furnace. It looked like a fire hole, and the bottom could not be seen. Only the edges were surrounded by misty clouds, and they looked like wisps, but if one got closer, they could see an incomparably huge swimming whale swimming back and forth. Michito Ichido said with emotion, "After I reached the true Yang realm, I couldn't suppress the restless vitality, so I created this world and cultivated here for hundreds of thousands of years. Just now, I came out of seclusion and visited fellow Taoists everywhere. It was very comfortable. Thinking about the scene back then, it seems to be right in front of my eyes." Speaking of this, his voice was full of emotion. Zhang Yan looked for a moment and felt a trace of unusual qi dynamic. He said, "There is a big array here. Was it set up by you?" Michito Ichido said, "Yes, the array set up around here is the flux space array used by Bu Su Tian to stabilize our mana. It is enough for the two of us to work together." Zhang Yan's eyes flickered and he said, "So this is the flux space formation." The jade slips collected by Emotsang and the others had records of this formation. According to the correct path, After a true yang cultivator achieved success, he would accidentally cause great damage to the worlds under his rule. He would even use this formation to restrain himself and only come out when he could control it as he wished. However, he could also choose not to make this choice and hide in the sea of vitality. However, the latter choice would usually result in the death of countless living beings. He did not know how to set up this formation, but fortunately he had the truth linking tablet and the spatial concealment jade membrane, which prevented such an outcome. Michihito Ichido said, "This formation is a bit complicated. If fellow Taoist is interested, you can give me a copy to take a look at later." Zhang Yan nodded and thanked him. "Thank you, fellow Taoist." After that, the two discussed for a while on how to refine the mystical qi. After discussing everything that needed to be thought of, Michito Ichido pointed his finger upwards. A spiritual light flew out and the dome above them split open. He turned his head and said, "The heaven and earth door is open. Fellow Taoist can come over now." Zhang Yan raised his hand and all the mystical qi flew up. He had obtained about 11 strands of mystical qi from Qinchan and the rest, and Dan Yi originally had one in his possession. Hence, he now had a total of 11 strands. Michito Ichido looked at it and said in admiration, "This item is a supreme treasure born from nature. Although it has fallen and scattered, it is still an extremely superior heaven and earth essence treasure." Zhang Yan said, "Fellow Taoist, please look after it for a while." Michito Ichido agreed and lifted his sleeve to receive all the mystical qi. Zhang Yan said, "Wait for a while." Then, his whole body suddenly dissipated like smoke. After a moment, the whole world shook violently. A brilliant light shone over, emitting endless light in an instant. It was him who had passed through the sea of origin qi. If it was a few decades ago, the commotion caused by his arrival would probably cause the flux formation below to collapse. Fortunately, he could freely restrain his origin qi now, so it did not cause too much of a commotion. When he reached the bottom, with a thought, he completely restrained the aura that had spread out and landed beside Taoist. However, the vast aura still made the countless floating whales below stiffen, not daring to move. Michito Ichido's real body was inseparable from this world, so it was only a matter of a thought for him to move here. At this moment he was already safe. He said, "I have seen the method, and there is no doubt about it. We can start the sacrificial refining at any time. Is there anything else that fellow Taoist needs to take care of?" Zhang Yan said, "Fellow Taoist Dan Yi has deduced the sacrificial refining method for a long time. I don't have anything else to say, so let's do it." The amazing thing about the strange qi was that it could reflect the existence of the past or the supreme treasure in one's mind into the world. But the objects here had already been reflected by Dan Yi, so there was no need for him to do it again. Now, they only needed to continue the process step by step. When Michito Ichido heard this, he did not delay any longer. With a flip of his palm, he sent 11 strands of strange qi into the sinkhole below. At the same time, Zhang Yan and he activated their primordial qi according to the method. The 11 strands of strange energy were originally distinct from each other, each living in harmony and not disturbing the other. However, after being activated by them, they began to spin rapidly. Then, as if they sensed that they came from the same source, they fused into one place. At this time, it first changed into a heavy feeling, and then there was the sound of flowing water. Then it was full of vitality, then bursts of heat, and finally, it became sharp and solid. It was not difficult for Zhang Yan to see that this place was changing the 5 elements. Where it was finally inclined to, it was inclined to which type of treasure. However, when this qi revealed the 5 elements, the levels were extremely clear, and it was very likely that there was a man-made method in it. Thinking that this qi was harvested and sacrificial refined by a powerful person, he could not help but be slightly moved. It was just that at this time, he was still in the sacrificial refining, so he did not have time to think too much. The qi dynamic changed between the 5 elements, and finally, it suddenly turned into a sudden sound of thunder. There were countless flashes of lightning, and then white steam rose up to the clouds, and then turned into countless drops of rain. In the sinkhole, clear water gradually rose up, and in the end, it filled the entire sinkhole and even overflowed. Around it, there was a magnificent waterfall that flowed down, and the rumbling sound shook the world. Seeing that the first step was very smooth, Zhang Yan and Michito Ichito had a little discussion, and at the same time, they focused their minds and began to visualize a black seed according to Dan Yi's method. At this time, they still did not know what exactly it was. Only when it was completely activated would they be able to see its full appearance. However, as they did so, the vitality of the two people was also constantly flowing away, and the amount was increasing. However, Michito Ichito was not surprised or happy. The more vitality was used here, it meant that the power of the future treasure was greater. However, if this situation continued, he did not know if they could withstand it, so he said, "Fellow Zhang, I did not expect to use so much vitality. Now that the treasure embryo has not been formed, if this continues, with the strength of the two of us, I'm afraid that we may not be able to perceive it. Why don't we withdraw one of us to recover first, and one of us will first hold it, and then we will take turns. What do you think, fellow Zhang?" Zhang Yan pondered for a moment. This was the method they had discussed before. But now that he thought about it again, he said, "That's not appropriate. I can see that the qi flow is like a tidal wave pushing against a dam. We can only do it in one go, we can't stop halfway. If one of us stops, there might be some turbulence or it might cause an unforeseen event." Michito Ichito said, "Then what do you think, fellow Zhang?" The light in Zhang Yan's eyes flickered and he said, "There's no need to use any tricks, the two of us are enough." He did not use all his strength, because there were still 3 celestial worlds in his divine decree. At this moment, with a thought, he withdrew the 3rd celestial world that just now had formed. Suddenly, his qi dynamic increased by a lot, but his vitality was still firmly controlled, and there was no chaos. Michito Ichito felt this, and was slightly surprised. Originally, the vitality that Zhang Yan revealed was already unparalleled, but he did not expect that there was still more that he had not used, and at this moment, he had a feeling that what he was showing now was perhaps far from his limit. At this moment, the inside of the giant sinkhole had become an incomparably vast lake, and in the deepest part, under the efforts of the two people, a black seed was born from nothing in the water. After a long time, a green bud broke out of the shell, and slowly grew and extended. As this long stem gradually reached the surface of the water, a wide floating leaf spread out. At this moment, the two could see that there seemed to be a celestial world that could not be seen clearly being born. The floating leaves on the surface of the water gradually increased, and soon occupied a third of the water. Finally, a golden lotus quietly came out of the green, but it did not open for a long time. Since the beginning of its growth, it had been constantly absorbing vitality from the outside, but at this stage, it no longer needed as much as before. The two could feel that this thing seemed to be actively attracting something over. At this moment, Michito Ichito suddenly said, "There's a qi dynamic coming from beyond the sky." Zhang Yan also felt it and nodded, "Seems like it has something to do with this Pauline." Michito Ichito also felt it and nodded, "Seems like it has something to do with this Pauline." As they spoke, they saw a clear qi coming from outside, shooting straight into the pool of water. The two discovered that it was actually another strange qi. They did not know where it landed, but this time, it was actively attracted by the golden lotus. With this qi dynamic, it seemed to have made up for something, and the flower bud actually bloomed. In an instant, it was dazzling with golden light, and looking at the number of petals, there were 32 on the upper petal, and 76 on the lower petal, making a total of 108 petals. But what was especially strange was that it seemed that each petal contained a world, and it was constantly evolving the cycle of life and death Tao. Michito Ichito clicked his tongue in wonder, contains the world inside, and plays the universe outside. Even in Busha heaven, this kind of treasure is rare. Moreover, what we see now is only a treasure embryo. In this way, when it is refined, the power of the divine ability is probably not inferior to those supreme treasures. Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Isn't this a good thing?" Michito Ichito admitted, "It is a good thing, I will not give up eating for fear of choking." With those Khanate demons in front, there was no need to worry about the power of this treasure at all. Even if they had to worry about this, it would be after the battle, and the premise was that they could survive. If they failed, it would not be their turn to think about these things. Zhang Yan looked at the golden lotus below, and a thoughtful expression appeared on his face. This thing had some origins, and perhaps it was not as simple as visualizing it out of thin air. However, he would only know when Danny returned. Chapter 1677. After Zhang Yan thought about it, he realized that although the golden lotus was born, it was still absorbing the qi of vitality and spiritual vigor continuously. It was not only the golden lotus, but also the lake underneath it. This was because the two were originally one. He said, "If this treasure stays here for a long time, it might be a hindrance to you." Taoist Yi sensed it as well. He was not afraid of collecting the qi of vitality and spiritual vigor. If it was not enough here, as a true yang cultivator, he could always transfer the qi of vitality from the other realms. He was worried that if the treasure was rooted here for a long time, it would be difficult to separate it without any damage. If this was an ordinary realm, it would be fine even if he removed it. However, this was his heart and soul, he could not simply abandon it. The golden lotus was visualized by the two of them after much effort, so it was impossible for him to remove it. He thought about it and said, "It's not a good idea to move now. Otherwise, all our efforts will be wasted. We can only wait for fellow Taoist Dan Yi to come back." Zhang Yan thought for a moment and said, "I have an idea. I have a magical item here. It's called the Essence Reflection Tablet of Truth Linking Stone. It can comprehend the mysteries of heaven and earth and gather the essence of the void. As long as the qi of vitality is able to flow through the worlds, this treasure will not be attached to this place." Taoist Yi was delighted. He cupped his fists and said, "I didn't expect fellow Taoists to have such a treasure." "Thank you." Zhang Yan replied, "It's all right." Michito Ichito gathered his qi and displayed his myriad world rotation in front of him. He said, "Please do it, fellow Taoist." However, other than this world, there were no living beings in the other worlds. This was because he had been preparing to deal with the Khanate demon 1,000,000 years ago. Therefore, he deliberately maintained this state so that he would not be tied down when the time came. With a flip of his palm, Zhang Yan activated the Lianjin steel. In an instant, the yuan qi of the myriad worlds was stirred up, like fish swimming, like pearls spinning. Originally, the spiritual vigor of the myriad worlds had a fixed place, but now, as if it was stirred up by an invisible hand, it was like a quiet pond had turned into flowing water. Although the golden lotus was still absorbing the external qi, it had cut off the connection between the realms. If it continued, it would no longer land here. When Taoist Yi saw that the moment this treasure appeared, all the spiritual qi in the heavens were connected. Wherever it wanted to increase or decrease, it was all within the control of the person in charge. He couldn't help but praise inwardly. Although this treasure couldn't be used for battle, it was the best to assist in cultivation and organize the myriad worlds. He was even more curious about where Zhang Yan's master came from. However, he had sealed his memories previously, so he did not think too much about it. With a thought from Zhang Yan, the Lianjin tablet began to move on its own. However, he discovered something else at this moment. The 108 worlds within the Golden Lotus also had spiritual vigor being nurtured. It was not difficult to see that when it accumulated to a certain point, as long as the treasure was willing, it could also give birth to living beings. This meant that the lotus was still growing and had not reached its final day of growth. After dealing with this matter, the two of them still needed to wait for Dan Yi to return. However, they could not ignore this place. The power of the lotus was not small. Who knew if there would be any changes? Thus, the two of them chose to sit here and watch. With the flux space formation, there was no need to worry about the leakage of energy. This was actually a good place. After Zhang Yan slightly recovered his essence, he sat down and visualized the sky world that had not been withdrawn for a long time in the spirit will. Previously, when he was creating this realm, he spent a lot of effort. This time, it was much smoother. At this moment, he found a chance to go to the first Heaven World Temple. The formation there was almost completed. However, the living beings there were no longer external threats. Instead, there was internal strife. However, this was a part of the evolution and was unavoidable. The fighting between the living beings was the driving force for them to move forward. Thus, he did not interfere much. After half a year, the golden lotus absorbed the spiritual opportunity like a whale. It finally slowed down a little. Since then, it had been maintained above a certain limit. Until one day, the two of them sensed something and came out of meditation. They looked towards the sky. The clouds there parted and a hole appeared in the void. Dan flew through the sky and floated down when he saw the two of them. He bowed and said, "I've troubled the two of you to wait." The two of them also bowed. Michihito Ichido took half a step forward and asked with concern, "Fellow Taoist, how was the result?" Dan revealed a smile and said, "The four Taoists have agreed to work together with me to perform this secret technique." Previously, the reason why Mo Tsang and the others rejected them was because they did not know the details of Bushutian. Thus, they could not act rashly. This time, he wanted to try to find out the current situation of the innate demon and ask the four of them to work together. Although the four of them did not agree, they did not reject him explicitly. Danny guessed that they would only know their true attitude when the result was out. Thus, he did not mention it further. After discussing how the two sides would cooperate, he hurried back. He said, "My four fellow Taoists have suggested that for the convenience of our calculations, we can work together to create a void space. This way, this void space will be fused with our vital qi, and it will be more convenient for us to use our power. What do you think?" Zhang Yan and Michihito Ichido discussed for a while and agreed that it was feasible. Danny looked at Zhang Yan and said, "Fellow Taoist Zhang, you have the strongest Yuan Qi among us. Therefore, fellow Taoist Lu Lin and I feel that you should take the lead this time." Zhang Yan knew that there was no need to be polite at this time. His control of Yuan Qi had reached the second level and was not much different from Lu Lin and the others. The only thing he lacked was the experience that he had accumulated over a long period of time. However, it was only deducing the secret technique and mainly using his own Yuan Qi to control the situation. The others could also assist from the side. These were all negligible. Therefore, he did not back down and agreed on the spot. Michihito Ichido smiled and said, "Before that, fellow Taoist needs to take a look at this golden lotus." Danny turned his head to look at the golden lotus that bloomed on the lake. Just now, when he arrived, he already saw it. After carefully sensing it, he realized that it was no different from the scene that he had sensed before. Seeing that it was constantly absorbing the spiritual vigor Yuan Qi from the surroundings, he said apologetically, "Sorry for troubling the two Taoists. I will take care of it." He circulated his Dharma power and replaced it with his own Yuan Qi Dharma power. The lake and the petals of the golden lotus moved slightly, and the lake water rippled. Then, it suddenly shrunk to a size and was held in his palm. The crater returned to its original state. Michihito Ichido asked curiously, "May I ask, fellow Taoist, did you visualize this golden lotus yourself, or was it reflected by some treasure in the past?" Danny shook his head and said, "Neither. It's just that when I wanted to visualize the fulfillment treasure, this thing appeared. It was as if I knew it since birth, but I couldn't know its true origin." He looked at the two of them again and said sincerely, "Fellow Taoists, you should know that after that great change, there were many karmic entanglements. Even familiar objects seem to be severed from us, clear but not clear. Even in our memories, we might not be able to find the whole picture. We can only follow that vague feeling. I can feel that this treasure is of great use to me, so I made this choice." Zhang Yan heard him say so and said, "Now that this treasure has been formed, it seems to be very powerful. This is all clear. Fellow Taoist's feeling is not wrong. As long as it can be used in this battle, it doesn't matter what its origin is." Michihito Ichido also said, "It's indeed a small matter." Dan Yi's heart moved and he kept the golden lotus. Then he said, "If fellow Taoists don't have any problems, why don't we start deriving the method now?" Zhang Yan nodded to express his agreement. If they created this method as soon as possible, they could find out the details of those demons and have more time to deal with them. Michihito Ichido also had no objections. At this moment, Danny handed over a jade scroll and said, I have discussed with fellow Taoist Lu and the others about the specific method of creating the realm. It's all recorded here. Since fellow Taoist Zhang is the host, please take a look. If there's anything wrong, we can make corrections. Zhang Yan took it and glanced at it. The method mentioned here was not complicated. The main thing was that the person who used it had to have a deep enough vitality to use it. This was indeed the most suitable thing for him to do. After reading it, he pondered for a moment and made a slight deduction in his spirit to see if there was anything wrong. After a while, he looked up and said, I'm going to start now. Dan Yi and Michihito Ichido both looked serious and said, Fellow Taoist, please. Zhang Yan's spirit changed. In an instant, an infinite world was extended in the void's primordial sea. It delineated the perimeter, divided the past and the future, and turned into countless possibilities. In an instant, it returned to its original state. In an instant, light was released and chaos was pushed away. Almost at the same time, 6 tyrannical consciousnesses poured in at the same time and entered this place. They helped him to stabilize the universe and divide the heaven and earth. This was also the reason why he made the first move. If he did not have a strong enough vitality as a foundation, he would not be able to bear the power of 7 people. Not to mention the next step. After this stage, there would be no more obstacles. After Zhang Yan stabilized his Yuan Qi, he discovered that Lu Lin and the others had only sent their auras and consciousnesses over, but they did not reveal their bodies. Obviously, for some reason, they did not want to show themselves. He did not mind, as long as the 4 of them were able to contribute, everything else was trivial. The method that Dan Yi and Lu Lin and the others discussed was that each of them had to deduce a method and finally merge it into one. However, if there was a mistake, they would have to start all over again. But if they failed many times, then the Qi dynamic would become more and more mixed, and there would be more and more variables. It was like the originally clear water was stirred up. If this was the case, they would have to start all over again. The part that he deduced was relatively simple. This was because the creation of heaven and earth would not consume a small amount of vitality. Of course, it would not put too much burden on him. There was also another reason. He guessed that it might be because they were worried that he would not be able to agree with everyone. Because in the way of deduction, it depended on the attainment of Tao. Perhaps in the eyes of everyone, although the vastness of his vitality might be above everyone, because he achieved it a little later, he might be slightly inferior in this aspect. This judgment was also reasonable because he had been searching everywhere to verify it. However, he was also happy to do so. As long as the result achieved his goal, there was no need to care about the process. Moreover, by doing this, he would have more spare energy to stabilize the heaven and earth, so that there would not be any turbulence. Chapter 1678. On one hand, Zhang Yan was stabilizing the sky, and on the other hand, he was deducing the cultivation method. Due to the recent improvement in his Tao method, the one he was in charge of was not difficult, and he quickly evolved it. At this moment, the others had not finished, but as everyone's Qi activity revolved, the sky was also shaking. Although it was not a big problem, he did not let his guard down, and exerted his power to protect it. After an unknown period of time, everyone had finished the cultivation method they were in charge of. This step was actually very easy to complete. The most crucial thing was still what they had to do next, which was for the 7 of them to cast the cultivation method at the same time and fuse their vital Qi as one. If there was a mistake here, they would have to rederive, because if they continued to exert force on this, it would cause the heavenly secrets to change too much, and that would undoubtedly increase the chance of the demons discovering them. Danny said, Fellow Taoist Zhang, is there anything wrong? First of all, there could not be any mistakes in the sky below them, or else as long as there was a slight fluctuation, it could possibly disrupt the original order. Zhang Yan said calmly, Fellow Taoists, you can rest assured with I maintaining here, there will not be any mistakes. Michihito Ichido said, Fellow Taoist Zhang's cultivation has greatly improved compared to before. It is not difficult to protect the sky and earth. Dan Yi trusted the 2 of them and said, Then everyone, let us begin. After the 7 of them were ready, they revolved the cultivation method at the same time. There could not be the slightest bit of negligence here, and it was best if they could succeed at the same time and try to reduce the difference in the vital qi used so that it would be convenient to converge at the end. Zhang Yan could feel the entire world seem to sink, but just now he was clearly not boasting, and with a light lift of his vital qi, he withstood it. At the same time, he also diverted his attention and revolved the cultivation method. Not long after, a dot of light appeared in the void. This was caused by the external manifestation of his mental image, and it also represented that he had completed what he was supposed to do here. Almost at the same time, 6 dots of light appeared at the same time and gradually closed in on one place. However, at this moment, everyone felt that these lights suddenly sped up and began to frantically absorb the surrounding air. Dan Yi's expression froze, because everyone's vital qi would definitely not be completely the same. When they gathered together, it was inevitable that they would clash with each other. If they could not quickly suppress and stabilize the situation, it would evolve into a world-destroying calamity. Although this was something he had predicted in his predictions, he didn't expect the turbulence to be so intense. He hurriedly reminded, "Everyone, please be careful." Michihito Ichido said, "Fellow Taoist, just now is a good thing that there are changes. Because of the changes, the Khanate fiendish demons will not be able to sense and predict the heavenly secrets after using it." Dan Yi was slightly worried and said, "But in this case, almost all the burden will fall on this world, so you can only rely on your own strength to bear it." At this time, they could not help, because originally it was only a slight difference in vital qi that led to this situation. If they added a bit more strength, it would definitely make the situation worse. Zhang Yan was very calm. He knew that the crisis here could only be resolved by him, the person who created the world, and outsiders could not interfere. There were 2 ways to do this. One was to let the qi dynamics collide, and after the turbulence passed, the 2 sides would reach a balance, and then it would naturally calm down. However, this might take a very long time, and the result was uncertain, because the qi dynamics would eventually contradict each other, and there was a possibility that it would self-destruct, and at that time, it might even destroy this world. As for the other way, it was to mediate. Because he was the master of this world, everything here was immersed in his vital qi. As long as he was willing, he could do it. Of course, whether or not he could actually accomplish it depended on the level of one's control of vital qi. Passively enduring was never his style, so he decisively made a move, and in the blink of an eye, he saw through every minute change. Not only that, because every single bit of qi activity here was exerted by the heart of the person behind it, and it even contained the person's thoughts and slight comprehension towards Tao arts. He similarly noticed all of this, but at this moment he didn't have the chance to look at it in detail, and he could only remember it. After that, he lightly fiddled with it a few times, and he'd sorted out the 7 different qi activities separately, causing them to break free from their original violent state. This series of actions was very clean and straightforward, without the slightest bit of sloppiness. Not only did it show a very profound cultivation of the Tao, but it also showed that his vital qi foundation was superior to others. When everyone saw this scene, they all exclaimed in admiration through the divine will. Because the 7 qi dynamics had reached a true balance, they immediately turned into a ring and then gradually moved closer to one point. After a long time, they finally became a golden leaf with an indefinite radius. Dan Yi's spirit was lifted and he said, "It's done." Michihito Ichito also nodded repeatedly and sighed, "I didn't think it would really be done." He paused and then said, "Taoist Zhang, please examine it and see if there are any flaws that need to be filled." Zhang Yan said yes, and with a wave of his hand, the small piece of golden leaf flew over and floated around his fingertips. This was the gathering of the power of 7 true yang cultivators, and logically speaking, the qi dynamics should have been very messy, but because he had guided it in the end, the rest of the qi dynamics were suppressed, and it seemed to have become pure. However, this might not be able to fool the Khanate demons, but the probability of it sneaking into Busu Tian was slightly higher. After looking, he said, "Taoist friends, there is no problem here." Danny relaxed, and he cupped his hands towards the sky and said, "Thank you, Taoist friends, for coming to help." Lu Lin and the others replied politely. Since this matter was already done, they didn't want to stay any longer, and after saying goodbye to Zhang Yan and the others, they all left, as if they didn't want to be too involved with the outer realm. Michihito Ichido said, "It seems that they really don't want to get involved." Danny said, "After we investigate the situation in Busu Tian, if the situation is as I expected, I will go there again to pay a visit." Michihito Ichido said, "The spell has been completed, and now we need to find a demon incarnation to plant. Do you two have a target?" Danny said, "Before this, I found a few suitable incarnations, but they seem to have been outside for a long time, and their vitality was greatly damaged." Zhang Yan thought for a moment and said, "Leave this matter to I." Because of the previous contact in the Yuhuan heavens, he had specially absorbed some of the aura. With this, he could sense the location of all the incarnations of the demon in the void primordial sea. It wasn't difficult to find a very suitable one. Danny looked at the golden leaf and said, "Taoist Zhang is in charge of this aura, so it is the safest for you to do it." Zhang Yan said, "Taoist friends, please wait for a moment. Whether this method succeeds or not, we will know in a moment." He focused, calculated the location of the aura, and followed it. After this damage, he found that there were about a dozen demon incarnations outside, and most of them had seriously damaged aura, so they didn't meet the requirements. However, there were two that were suitable. After a short selection, he chose the one with the weaker aura. This was because usually, the incarnation with the strongest aura was also the one that the main body paid the most attention to. Perhaps the main body would have such an arrangement, so this choice was safer. This demon incarnation was sleeping in a deserted world at this moment. Its appearance was like a leopard cat, with two tails behind it, and one on the left and one on the right that could cover its body. Through the shadow of the past, it was constantly looking for worlds with spiritual vigor, and devouring them completely. To strengthen the incarnation, it usually absorbed the vitality from the sea of primordial chi, but if it was not possible, then it would be through devouring the world. However, if the main body was still under strict control, then the first method would not be so easy to achieve, and usually only the second method could be used. Zhang Yan raised his finger and pointed on the golden leaf, and this thing instantly penetrated countless worlds, or perhaps it passed through everything. It was still in front of him a moment ago, and in the next moment, it entered the incarnation. The leopard cat did not notice at all, and was still sleeping soundly there, or rather, circulating the spiritual vigor in its body that just now had swallowed. He sensed a little, and found that if he were to use the spell now, he could use his own thoughts to replace the demon's consciousness, and make it completely a puppet that was at his disposal. However, he did not choose to do so because it was very risky. It was possible that before he actually entered Busu Tian, the demon behind him would sense that something was wrong. Only by nourishing things silently could it play its role to the greatest extent, so he only instilled a consciousness into it and did not do anything. Not long after, the leopard cat incarnation suddenly quivered and suddenly woke up. It was just that there was some restlessness in the depths of its heart, and it also had a thought. It seemed that it had been out for so long, but it had not returned once. Moreover, it had destroyed so many worlds of the human path, it could go back to claim credit. Perhaps it could even get the main body's permission to absorb the vitality from the sea of primordial chi. As soon as this thought arose, it could no longer restrain itself. It turned around and leaped, already appearing in the void space outside Busu Tian. Zhang Yan watched there quietly. He could have waited slowly, but doing so would only increase the chance of the demon discovering him. Therefore, the faster he moved, the better. As long as he entered Busu Tian and came into contact with the main body's chi, it would be enough for him to understand the situation. The civet cat paced around outside for a moment, then leapt in and entered the sky world. Almost at the same time, it connected with an aura. This aura was incomparably vast, like the starry sky of an abyss. But in the blink of an eye, it became filled with malice. In the next instant, everything became blank. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed slightly. The incarnation had only entered the void space for a moment, but it was killed, indicating that the demon had a secret method or treasure with it. It could attack the incarnation without any scruples, but more importantly, he had also used this opportunity to find out what he needed to know. "Friend, how is it?" Dan Yi saw that he did not speak for a long time, but could not help but ask. Zhang Yan looked up at the two of them and said in a low voice, "Just now I have come into contact with a Khanate demon. Just by looking at its qi dynamic, it is full of vitality, without the slightest sign of damage." Chapter 1679. Dan Yi's expression darkened. After a while, he asked slowly, "Fellow Taoist Zhang, is that true?" Zhang Yan nodded and said, "These demons definitely don't know that we are going to investigate. Therefore, what I feel should be true. Just now, we only came into contact with one of them. As for the rest of the demons, I don't know." Michito Ichito also frowned and said, "The situation here is a little difficult to judge. Perhaps these demons didn't even touch the treasure?" Their previous plan was based on Dan Yi's intuition. He believed that these Xiantian demons were refining that supreme treasure and had lost a great deal of their vitality. Thus, this was the best time for them to launch a surprise attack. If that wasn't the case, then their previous plan would have to change. Dan Yi seriously said, "Fellow Taoists, although I have no proof, my previous intuition shouldn't be wrong. These demons must have been attempting to refine the supreme treasure. If their vitality hadn't been damaged, it's very likely that they'd have given up on trying to do so after seeing how difficult it was." Zhang Yan did not know why Dan Yi was so sure, but he could feel that Dan Yi's words were very sincere and there was no deception. However, this matter did not affect him much. Therefore, he believed that there was nothing absolute in this world. He could not expect his opponent to make a stupid mistake. In the end, it still depended on his own strength. Therefore, he had never placed his hope of success on this. Michito Ichito thought for a while and said, "Could it be that this person has already obtained the treasure?" Danny shook his head and said, "It is not easy to subdue the treasure. 1,000,000 years is definitely not enough. Otherwise, fellow Taoist Huantong would not have set up the prohibition for such a long time." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. He agreed with this explanation. Back then, the founding master of Qingjue Mountain could probably calculate how long it would take to form a blood bond with a treasure. 1,000,000 years should be just the right amount of time. This generation could try to form a blood bond with a treasure, but he would not be able to achieve complete success. From this point of view, even if Dan Yi did not sense it, his previous choice was not wrong. Michito Ichito said, "I have only heard a little about the treasure. What is it? Can you tell me in detail?" Dan Yi hesitated for a moment before saying, "There's nothing to hide at this point." He paused for a moment and said, "Because after the upheaval, some of my karma with the inner realm was severed and my memories disappeared. I can't tell you the name of that treasure or what kind of power it has, but I can tell you something related to it. This treasure is a natural creation, born from Bu Su Tian. As soon as it appeared, everyone knew that the power of this treasure was great, almost above all other treasures, so they wanted to submit. However, this caused a dispute because after it was refined, it was difficult to decide who would be the one to wield this treasure. This matter has been discussed for more than 10,000 years. Because we were unable to find a suitable person to control it in the end, the fellow Taoists finally decided to refine this treasure and suppress it in a realm. No one is allowed to touch it rashly and it cannot be easily revealed to the outside world. If one day we encounter a powerful enemy, then it won't be too late to send someone to retrieve it." When Zhang Yan and Michito Ichito heard this, they understood. No one dared to let others control such a powerful thing because it was undoubtedly a threat to their own lives. Danny said, "Back then, in order to refine this treasure, it took about 1,000,000 years. The number of people who participated in it far exceeded the number of demons and monsters. Therefore, it is impossible for this generation to subdue it in 1,000,000 years." Taoist Yi pondered for a long time and said, "Perhaps it was as Taoist Danny said. He tried to subdue this treasure, but when he saw that it was impossible and was afraid that he would exhaust too much of his vitality, he could only give up." Zhang Yan also thought that this possibility should not be ruled out, because Patriarch Huantong and the other two had killed their way into Bu Su Tian. If those demons were more cautious, they might really give up on this. After all, they already had a lot of magic treasures in their hands, and they already had a great advantage. Another magic treasure would just be icing on the cake, but if their strength was damaged, it would instead give the demons an opportunity. As for the possibility that the demons would split up, the others would be refining their supreme treasures, and the demon he came into contact with just now would be in charge of guarding, so his chi dynamic would be intact. It was not impossible, but it was extremely unlikely, because the result would be that both of them would not be able to refine their supreme treasures with all their might, and they would not be able to guarantee that they would have enough power to defend against external enemies. In the end, both of them would fail. At this time, Danny looked at the two and asked solemnly, "No matter what, it is very likely that the demons will not have their origin energy damaged at this moment. What do you think, fellow cultivators?" With this result, it was impossible to persuade Song and the other three, but if Zhang Yan and Michito Ichido gave up because of this, he could not do it alone no matter what. Michito Ichido said with a smile, "I am not a human path cultivator. Even if I want to hide in the world that fellow cultivator Lu Lin and the others have opened, I am afraid that the four of them will not accept me. It seems that I can only go all the way with you." Danny did not say anything. He only bowed solemnly to him. He knew that Michito Ichido was only joking. If he was really willing to hide in that world, as long as he was willing to cut off the karma of the past, then Taoist Lu Lin would not reject him. At this time, both of them looked at Zhang Yan. Among the three of them, his origin energy was the strongest, and it involved another fellow cultivator who was about to reincarnate, so his attitude was the most important. However, when Zhang Yan saw the two looking at him, he smiled and said with a calm expression, "Fellow cultivator Dan Yi once said that even if I do not kill that demon today, it will come to kill me in the future. If that treasure has not been refined properly, then this is our only chance. Therefore, no matter what that demon does, I will go with the two of you." As for the other possibility, which was that the demon had subdued the treasure, he did not say much about it. If it had really come to this, then there was no need to think about anything else. Dan Yi's heart relaxed, and he also bowed to Zhang Yan solemnly. Michito Ichido also nodded inwardly. He knew in his heart that he might not really have the chance to enter that world. However, as a human path cultivator, if Zhang Yan suggested hiding, Song and the others would definitely agree. Even under such circumstances, he was still willing to stand with them, which was enough to show his determination. It was no wonder that he was the only person who had achieved true yang since the Great Upheaval. Zhang Yan judged calmly, "Now that we know the situation of the demon, it's better than before. If we found out about it during the battle, we would be caught off guard. That would be a disaster. Now, we at least have a chance to deal with it." Danny said in a low voice, "We have at most 100 years. We must find more ways to fight against the demon." Michito Ichido thought for a moment and said, "Please wait for a moment." He suddenly disappeared. After a few breaths, he reappeared in front of the two of them and took out an incomplete copper talisman. "I found this when I was traveling outside. Its origin is not simple. Perhaps you can find something from it. Fellow Taoists, why don't you take a look?" Dan Yi first took it, looked at it, and then passed it to Zhang Yan. "Fellow Taoist, please take a look." Zhang Yan took it and also looked at it. No wonder Michito Ichido valued it so much. At this moment, not only could he not see the past shadow of the copper talisman, but he could also feel a strong wei from it, and there were many subtle and mysterious patterns on it. After a while, he said, "This thing is very likely to be a secret talisman to open a forbidden array." Michito Ichido said, "I also think so. Previously, I studied it for a long time, just to decipher the hidden words on it, and I roughly know where that place is. Originally, I had no intention of breaking into this person's arrangement, but to deal with that demon, it seems that I have to try to find it. Since that place is guarded so tightly, there should be something hidden, and it might be useful to us." He was also a true yang cultivator. No matter how powerful the owner of the forbidden array was, he didn't think that he could be more powerful than him. Therefore, he never thought of taking anything, but at the moment, This was the only thing he could do. Danny was silent for a while, then sighed. I have also heard of a few cave dwellings opened by fellow Taoists in the Void Essence Sea. I originally didn't want to disturb them, but for the sake of dealing with the demon, I have to make an exception this time. Zhang Yan thought for a while. There were many records in the Kuan residence, but they could only be read when one's cultivation reached a certain level. Ever since he subdued his own Yuan Qi and successfully reached the second level, he hadn't gone there yet. Perhaps he could find some methods from there. He said, "We don't have much time to waste. If that's the case, let's split up." Dan Yi and Michito Ichito both agreed. Because these things wouldn't take too much time, the three of them decided to meet again half a year later, then went their separate ways. Zhang Yan wanted to return to the Kuan residence immediately, but just as he was about to, his heart skipped a beat, and he didn't do so. Instead, he sent a strand of his consciousness back to his body in the Red Continent. He suddenly opened his eyes, and a dim light flashed in them. Then he stood up. After becoming a true yang, his body had been constantly receiving the infusion of that indescribable thing. Compared to before, it was unknown how many times stronger it was. But no matter how much it grew, it was still within the sixth revolution of strength path. He raised his head and looked around. Between the heaven and earth, there was an everlasting scarlet color. Just now, he suddenly had a sudden impulse, and there must be a reason. He must have sensed something, and maybe he could find a fortuitous encounter here to increase his strength again. Just as he was thinking about this, there was a clear sound. The demon's subduing slip seemed to be responding to him, and flew out of his sleeve. Then, it circled around him, as if it was escaping into the distance. It wasn't really leaving him, but escaping into the reversal of heaven and earth. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed. He thought for a while, then also stepped forward. Then he felt his mind sinking, and the scarlet color around him gradually faded, turning into nothingness. If this place was compared to a lake, then when he reached the sixth revolution, he had only touched the shallow layer, but now he was going deeper into the lake that he had never touched before. Chapter 1680. Zhang Yan found that as he went deeper into the reverse of heaven and earth, he could no longer see anything. Everything faded away, and only that trace of his true self remained. Although his body was sinking, it also felt like it was expanding endlessly. This was contradictory, but also very natural. Not long after, a strange feeling appeared in his heart. It seemed that if this continued, this strand of consciousness would form an independent self and separate from the main body. If that was the case, it would not be a good thing. For example, the true Yang avatar. Although his thoughts were pure when he formed it, no one knew what would happen to the strength path body. Should he advance or retreat? He had to make a choice. After thinking for a while, he decided to continue. After reaching the sixth revolution, he found that the Lord of Qi Lu had his own reasons for helping him. However, no matter what the Lord of Qi Lu's true intentions were, he guessed that before his cultivation reached a certain level, the Lord of Qi Lu would only make things convenient for him and not hinder him. Just reaching the sixth revolution might not be enough, so there should not be any problems. Moreover, being able to feel this meant that it was still within his control. If there really were any problems, his consciousness came from the true Yang avatar, and he had a way to retreat before any problems occurred. His prediction was very accurate. Even though this feeling still existed, no unforeseen events had occurred in the end. As he immersed himself in this place for a long time, he gradually found out the true reason. This was because his consciousness had separated from his main body after entering this place. At this moment, it looked like a strand of his consciousness had arrived, but in truth, it was a part of him. Although it was not everywhere, it would not be affected no matter where it landed in the void primal sea. As for going to Bushu Tian, it was hard to say because it had only been a short instant, and he had borrowed the power of 7 people. However, there were signs of weakening here. This meant that this place might have landed outside the void primal sea and was no longer in the heavens. While thinking, his body suddenly paused. This did not mean that he had stopped. Instead, he had become one with this place. At this moment, the strength that the mysterious object was pouring into his body suddenly increased by a large margin. It was far from what it was before. It was like the difference between a trickling stream and a surging river. If the foundation of his body wasn't strong enough, not only would he not be able to benefit from it, he might even be destroyed by it. Fortunately, he had stayed on the Scarlet Continent for several dozen years, which was why he was able to endure it. If he had entered this place from the very beginning, his consciousness might have been taken away, and only a body would be left floating here, unable to leave. As the power accumulated in his body became stronger, an unfathomable thought climbed up from the bottom of his heart. In that instant he understood many things. Reaching the 7th transformation of the divine contract wasn't as difficult as he thought it would be. Just like how he needed the jade of Zhou Yuan to reach the true yang stage, he also needed an item to reach the 7th transformation, and it was on this Scarlet Continent. If he was willing, he could take this step at any time, and he could make up for everything he lacked in an instant. However, in order to gain something, he had to pay a price, and he had to bear the consequences of his actions. Just from what he could sense, it was something he could not bear at the moment, and this was only a small part of it. There were even greater dangers hidden behind. He pondered deeply for a long time. He felt that before he had made sufficient preparations or reached a certain level, it was not appropriate for him to take this step. After making his decision, he prepared to leave this place, but there was no need for his body to leave. After all, cultivating here was far more beneficial than cultivating in the center of the world. In the future, when he thought of a solution, he could come back here. As a result, he withdrew his consciousness. The next moment, he arrived in the Kuan residence. Looking around, he saw a glowing jade slip floating in a shrine cave. As for the rest of the world, it was still empty. He walked to the front and took the jade slip in his hand. After a brief pause, a mysterious technique appeared in his mind. What was mentioned here was not some powerful divine ability, but rather how a true yang cultivator could improve themselves after reaching a certain level in their Tao arts and enter a deeper realm. He pondered deeply for a moment. According to his own understanding, perhaps this was the prerequisite to enter the 3rd level. No matter if it was Fu Qingming, Taoist Emote Song, or the others, they'd never seen such a record, and it could be considered to be an extremely precious secret technique. More importantly, it also mentioned some external objects that could assist in cultivation, and their origins all pointed to Bushutian. He subconsciously realized that whether it was the rise and fall of humanity or his own cultivation, Bushutian was the key. Only by taking back this place could he move forward. Unfortunately, this did not seem to be of much help in dealing with the demons. He pondered for a long time. The demons were difficult to deal with, and the most important thing was that they had supreme treasures. But without treasures, could it be that he could not fight against them? That might not be the case. For example, the secret technique passed down by the great underworld ancestor could directly find the true location of a true yang cultivator and cut off their origin energy. Therefore, he did not have any powerful magic tools, so he could only rely on his secret techniques to resist. There were only a few secret techniques passed down by the pill ancestor. As for the Tao techniques he learned after talking with Emote Song and the others, they were more focused on cultivation. However, these were clearly not enough to deal with battle. His eyes flashed. Since that was the case, he could only deduce it himself. Instead of relying on others, it was better to rely on himself. Now that he had endless spirit intent and origin energy, as well as the jade fragment, he did not believe that he could not deduce some Tao techniques that could compete with his enemies in tens of thousands of years. Thinking of this, his consciousness turned and he returned to the Green Sky Hall to carefully organize his thoughts. Logically speaking, as long as a cultivator grasped enough abilities and secret techniques and had enough vitality, they would be able to deal with all sorts of situations. In fact, some abilities that weren't originally meant to be used to vanquish an enemy might be even more effective if used well. However, time was of the essence and he could not take care of everything. Thus, he could only choose to focus on battle. And the secret techniques used in battle were both offensive and defensive. One was to protect and the other was to kill. In terms of attack, the secret method passed down by the Grandmaster was undoubtedly the most powerful. However, the demons also had a way to avoid it. This was an obstacle. If he could break through it, then he would be able to go straight in, bypass all the obstacles, and kill his way to the front. Even if he couldn't kill the enemy in one move, he would be able to take the initiative in his own hands. He understood that the reason he could not calculate it before was because the technique passed down by the ancestor only pointed out a direction. This technique was very profound, but it might not necessarily be perfect. There was actually a large blank space and there was still room for improvement. Perhaps this was purposely done by the ancestor. If he could perfect it himself, perhaps he would be able to achieve his goal. It was just that the Xiantian demons had achieved Tao for a long time and no one knew what they had learned. He could not place all his hopes on them. It was obviously not appropriate to walk the path to the end. If he was blocked, there would be no way to counterattack. Thus, he had to look for other ways to break through. For example, the forbidden array passed down by the patriarch was an excellent breakthrough point. If he could deduce some trapping methods from it, and combine it with the several celestial realms visualized in the divine will, it could also be a killing move. Apart from that, there was also the art of protection. This was also extremely important. After all, the demons had treasures in their hands. If they were not careful, they would be trapped or suppressed. At that time, no matter how outstanding their skills were, they would not be able to use them. Even if he did not find out that the demon's origin energy was complete, he planned to deduce the protective technique after subduing the origin energy. However, he had not seen the treasures of the demons. Dan Yi and the others only knew that these treasures were very powerful, but they did not know how powerful they were. This was undoubtedly very disadvantageous to him. Thus, he thought about it. He did not expect to be able to block these treasures. As long as he could slightly dodge or delay their attacks, he would have a chance to counterattack. Luckily, he had the true connection steel and the hidden space jade membrane as reference. As long as he could avoid these two treasures, even if it was only for a short moment, he would have a chance to avoid the other treasures. Even if it was useless, he still had the dashing God Heaven Scroll as his last resort. After thinking about this, he immersed his consciousness into the broken jade and tried to deduce. Half a year passed in the blink of an eye. In the blink of an eye, it was time for the three to meet again. After Zhang Yan felt something, he did not move. He only separated a strand of consciousness to open up a celestial world and waited on a floating island. Not long after, Michihito Ichito and Dan Yi entered the celestial world. For the three of them, half a year was just a short time. Therefore, after greeting each other, they went straight to the main topic. Michihito Ichito said in a deep voice, "After I went to that formation, I found out that it was the cave residence of the exalted holiness Xianrong. However, I don't know where he went." Zhang Yan said, "So, it's this one." In the jade slips left behind by Emote Song and the others, the names of the past real young bigwigs were recorded. However, this one didn't have a good ending. Busha Heaven wasn't a peaceful place. Battles were everywhere. The most intense one was the battle between the Heartless Doctrine and the Sentient Doctrine. Sometimes, the battle of Tao intent was more powerful than the battle of interest. The two sides had many battles of Tao. Some of them were defeated, and some of them were expelled from Busha Heaven. The exalted holiness Xianrong was one of the latter. Michihito Ichito said, looking at the traces in the cave residence, he must have used the art of revival. However, he was injured by a supreme treasure, and his foundation was damaged. This time, he didn't make any movements. I'm afraid that he didn't succeed. This time, I took the item that he left behind, and I owe him a favor. If I can survive this tribulation, I have to find a way to repay him. Zhang Yan smiled faintly. The exalted holiness doctrine was the heartless doctrine, and he wouldn't do things without a purpose. The reason why he left the treasure and sealed it with a restrictive formation might be because of this. He said, "What did you get?" Chapter 1681. Taoist Yi took out a black jade chessboard, on which were engraved the elements of the stars, as well as the Qianquan longitude and latitude. Silver streams of light flickered within the chessboard. As soon as he took it out, it seemed as if there was an additional object on the chessboard. Zhang Yan saw it clearly. The extra item should be the world under his feet, but at that moment, it was reflected inside. Danny took a step forward and saw that a corner of the chessboard was missing. It seemed to have triggered a certain consciousness. He pondered for a moment and said, "Could this be the legendary circling throat?" Michito Ichito replied, "That's right. This item should have landed in the void primordial sea long before the Great Change. Otherwise, I might not have been able to see its origin under the severing of karma." Zhang Yan asked, "What's the use of this item?" Michito Ichito said, "Fellow Taoist Xianrong is also from a large sect. The circling throat is a protective artifact passed down in his sect since ancient times. It can reflect all things in the sky and predict the future changes. Cultivators can use this to predict. If they find the right path, they can turn misfortune into blessing." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. To put it simply, this item could predict some changes in the future. Although true young cultivators would be able to sense it before the arrival of the tribulation, sometimes it involved the same generation or the heavenly secrets were concealed by others. Then they might not be able to avoid it. If this item was worthy of its name, it would be equivalent to having an additional artifact that could predict good or bad luck. Even if they suddenly encountered an enemy, they might be able to rely on this item to find a way to defeat the enemy. In general, if it was used well, it would be very useful. Danny said, "This treasure could be said to be used wonderfully in the hands of Shinrong back then. Every time he encountered danger, he could avoid it in advance. This person would only fight when he had a chance of winning. Even if someone attacked his original sect, he did not care at all. However, later on, he was schemed against and lost a corner of this item. As a result, he made a mistake in his calculations. Otherwise, it would be hard to say who would win the battle back then." Zhang Yan said, "This is due to relying too much on the instrument and neglecting the cultivation of one's own Tao. How can the heavens will be able to predict everything? It was precisely because he had the upper hand earlier that there was the change of the missing corner." Michihito Ichito sighed and said, "The ruthless path, as long as it is beneficial to oneself, one must take it all. Seizing people, seizing oneself, seizing the heavens." Back then, the two sides fought fiercely because they had different opinions, but it also damaged the momentum of humanity. Otherwise, there would have been a great change, and Busu Tian would not have been so easily taken over by the demons. Danny said, "It's hard to judge here. If you don't know how to restrain yourself in the path of emotion, if you don't study the Tao of Tao, if you're not careful, you'll bring harm to others and yourself." Michihito Ichito wanted to say something, but he realized that continuing this topic was actually not a good thing, so he stopped and changed the topic. "What did fellow Taoist Danny find?" Danny shook his head and said, "Those caves were empty, similar to the residences of my peers that I found. There were only a few techniques that were passed down. Moreover, they were deduced from the Tao of Tao that I studied daily, so it was not complete. It could be considered a wasted trip." Zhang Yan's heart moved. Now that he was deducing the secret method, these left behind by his peers could also be used for reference. He said, "Fellow Taoist, have you memorized it?" Danny took out a bamboo book and handed it over, saying, "These are the painstaking efforts of my peers, so it can't be wasted. I've memorized it all. If fellow Taoist has any use for it, feel free to take it." Zhang Yan took it and roughly glanced at it. The content was obscure, and the things it talked about were also mysterious. He knew that Danny was not lying, because this was left behind when he studied the Tao of Tao, so it was extremely valuable. After thanking him, he kept it in his sleeve. At this moment, Michihito Ichito said again, "After I dispel the restrictive formation other than this throat coil, I also saw a lot of precious materials. They must have been collected by Shinrong. It seems that they want to use them to complete the missing corner of this object. I wonder if the elephant dragon golden cauldron can complete it with these?" Zhang Yan thought for a while, then said, "Wait for I to find this treasure, I'll come over and ask." He waved his hand and took the elephant dragon golden cauldron, placed it in front of the three of them, and asked. After a while, the consciousness of the elephant dragon golden cauldron was transmitted. It can't return to its original form, but with enough precious materials, it can still be 70 to 80%. Michihito Ichido said, "That's enough." He did not really expect this object to return to its original form, but if it could really exert 70 to 80% of its original power, it would be good enough. Zhang Yan said, "The golden cauldron is here. If the two of you have any instrument that is not to your liking, you can sacrifice it together." As he spoke, he suddenly felt something. With a thought, he saw a jade disc flying out, shining brightly in front of him. It was the sky-concealing jade membrane that was left behind by Yu Huan, the founding master of Mount Qingju. Michihito Ichido looked at him and said, "This treasure is not complete yet. If you want to sacrifice it, I'm afraid you'll have to wait for a while." Dan Yi saw that something was wrong and asked, "My friend, is there something wrong?" Zhang Yan looked at it and said, "You'll know in a while." As soon as he finished speaking, a spiritual light flew from the sky and landed on the jade disc. In an instant, it turned from illusory to solid, and the jade luster was even brighter than before. Not only that, the belly of the object was slightly bulging, as if it was breathing in and out. Dan Yi and Michihito Ichido were stunned. The scene just now was clearly a sign that the treasure had been completed. They knew that the treasure was originally divided into two. One was in Zhang Yan's hands, and the other was in the Outer Heaven Prohibition Formation, which was used to ambush those innate demons. Now that the two had merged into one, it meant that the formation had most likely collapsed. The two of them quickly used their spells to check, but they found that the formation was still intact. Not only that, the aura was the same as before, and there was nothing strange on the surface. They were stunned. Zhang Yan had also witnessed this scene. He pondered for a moment and said, "This should be something that fellow Taoist Huantong left behind. After all, that place can't stop the demons anymore. If we keep the treasures and can't fuse them together, then we'll lose a precious treasure that we can use. That's why we sent it over." Michihito Ichido said with a serious expression, "This is a risky move. If those fiendish demons had a sudden impulse and tried to break through the formation, it was very likely that they would discover the truth." Zhang Yan judged calmly, "Although the treasure has returned with half of it, the aura of the formation is still there, and it hasn't changed at all. Those demons won't know that something is missing, and they won't discover anything wrong. They won't know if this is a trap that fellow Taoist Yu Huan purposely set up. They have waited for 1,000,000 years, so they won't be stingy with 100 years. Before they are sure, they won't act rashly, but it seems like there's nothing to worry about at the moment." Dan Yi said with a serious expression, "However, the treasure is missing and it doesn't have something to suppress it, so it's not obvious now. But as time goes on, it'll be easier for it to be exposed. I thought there would be another 100 or 200 years, but now it seems like we'll see in 100 years at most." Michihito Ichido shook his head and said, "100 years is too long, maybe only a few decades. There's not much time left for us to prepare." Zhang Yan also understood that this change was too sudden. Although it was as he had said, the fiendish demons might not attack immediately, but the timing was definitely different from what he had previously thought. Once the great formation was broken, the fiendish demons would be able to attack at any time, so they had to hurry up. He thought for a while and said, "Fellow Taoist Yi, let's help you repair the coiled throat first, then use this item to calculate when the formation will be broken." With his reminder, Michihito Ichido immediately felt that it was a good idea, and his spirit was slightly lifted. He said, "That's right, we can test the ability of this treasure." He waved his sleeves and scattered all the treasured materials. The elephant dragon golden cauldron buzzed and swallowed them. After a while, he felt that there was an agitation of qi inside. It was not the first time he used this item, so he knew what to do. He took out the coiled throat and let it fall into the cauldron. Then, a pool of jade liquid swam over and wrapped it up. About a few days later, there was a bubbling sound, as if water was boiling. Then, there was a dense mist inside, and the treasure was lifted up from within. The jade liquid that had spread on the surface slowly retreated, as if it had seeped into the item. When the three looked again, they saw that the missing corner had been repaired. Not only that, whether it was judging from the qi or the appearance, they could not tell that it had been damaged before. Michihito Ichido changed his mind, and the artifact came in front of him. He tried to sense it for a while, and found that its qi was renewed. The previous decadence was completely washed away, and the qi flowed smoothly. He could not help but exclaim, "The elephant dragon golden cauldron fruit is a rare treasure." After saying that, he touched it with his hand and wiped it gently. Suddenly, the starlight on the plate began to spin, and scenes immediately appeared in his mind. In just a moment, he had a result. Seeing him like this, Danny said, "Fellow Taoist, how is it?" Michihito Ichido said, "The scene is obscure, but it is not because of this treasure. It should be due to the lack of external factors that can be deduced." At this moment, he was already clear that if he wanted to make good use of this treasure, then he had to find a way to clearly understand the background of the target he was calculating. The more he knew, the clearer the results he would obtain. If he only knew a little, then it would be rather blurry. He looked up at Zhang Yan. "Can you lend me the spatial concealment jade membrane for a while?" Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Of course." With a thought, he sent the void concealment jade membrane over. Michihito Ichido took it, held it in his hand, and tried to activate it. After another breath, he looked up and said, "According to my deductions, the demons and devils will be able to break through the restrictive spell in at least 30 years. If nothing happens in 30 years, the longest they can last is 100 years. However, it is not necessarily safe inside. During that time, the demons and devils might come out. After 100 years, the restrictive spell will no longer exist." He looked at the two of them and said, "Just now, I have made 3 deductions in a row, and the results are the same." Zhang Yan's eyes flickered, and he said, "In other words, we have to make preparations to break into the Busa heavens within 30 years. Michihito Ichido said in a low voice, "I'm afraid that is the case." Zhang Yan thought about it for a moment. At the moment, there was one more thing he needed to worry about. Fu Qingming had not yet reincarnated, and if he learned about the situation in the Yuhuan heavens, he would definitely come looking for them. Zhang Yan needed to go there and make some arrangements. There were also some matters in the mountain and sea realm that he needed to take care of. Chapter 1682. Zhang Yan thought that he had many things to do, so he bade farewell. Dan Yi and Michihito Ichido guessed that he probably wanted to go back and make arrangements for his disciples upon seeing that the situation had changed. Therefore, they did not stop him and only sent him off with congratulatory gifts. Since Zhang Yan still needed to refine the innate golden lotus, he left the elephant dragon golden cauldron behind. After bidding farewell to the two, he sent a wisp of his will back to the universal heavens. In the Green Jade Palace, Elder Peng was inspecting the merit tablets presented to him by various realms. A few elders from other realms followed behind him and evaluated the juniors who had made great contributions over the years. An elder suddenly said, "Among the various realms, only Xian Hongtian's merit points is ranked at the bottom. There are not many outstanding people. Rumor has it that there are many extraterrestrial cultivators there." Elder Peng did not take it seriously and said, "Heavenly Lord, he has only achieved his merit points not long ago. He has not personally gone to kill demons and evil spirits, so his merit points are naturally not that much. However, in terms of merit points, it is not less than the other realms. Moreover, if the extraterrestrial cultivators are willing to give us merit points, isn't that a good thing?" Another elder Daoran said, "What Hall Master said is right. Judging one's merit points based on merit points is not the way to go. Imparting merit points to outsiders is already a great contribution." Elder Pringdaoran said, "That's right. All of you must understand that although the method of merit points is driven by profit, the word good comes first. If you only talk about profit without caring about good, it is easy to go astray." Everyone nodded in agreement. At this moment, a disciple hurried to the front and bowed to Elder Peng. He also transmitted a few words to him. Elder Peng's expression was normal as he said, "All of you can discuss merit points here first. I have something to deal with later. I will take my leave now." An elder said with a smile, "I dare not. Elder Peng has a lot of matters to attend to. There is no need for you to accompany us idlers." Elder Peng grunted and flew away. When he returned to the palace and landed, He stopped and said to the executor disciple outside the palace, "There's no need to follow me." After that, he walked out alone. However, the moment he passed through the door, he felt dazed. It was as if he had stepped into another world. The temple looked the same, but he couldn't see anyone. It was as if he was the only one left. He composed himself and continued walking forward. When he arrived at the main hall, he saw a young Taoist in a black robe looking at the myriad worlds map. He hurriedly took a few steps forward and greeted, "Exalted Master Zhang." Zhang Yan turned around and said, "Under Elder Peng's leadership, the Yuhuan All Heavens is much more prosperous than before." Elder Peng shook his head and said, "The method of karma points can be accepted by the people of the various realms because there are still external enemies above us. However, regardless of whether they are demons or demons, there will be a day when we kill them all. When that time comes, we will have to look for new opponents." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Now is not the time to worry about this. Moreover," he said meaningfully, "it's not that easy to kill all the demons." Elder Peng could tell that there was a deeper meaning in his words, but he couldn't understand it at the moment. He lowered his head and thought for a while, then bowed and said, "Exalted Master Zhang, I wonder if you have anything to tell me now that you have returned?" Zhang Yan said calmly, "It's not far from the day when the palace master will return." He had just arrived at this place when he felt the flow of qi. It was obvious that the circulation of karma points was smooth, and Fu Qingming would be able to come back to life in no time. This was a good thing, but it was also possible that as the day of his return to the world was approaching, he sensed the approaching danger, and thus hastened his original pace. Elder Peng was surprised and said, "Exalted Master, are you saying that the palace master will return soon?" Dugahang didn't tell him all the details, but he knew that the return of his grandmaster was related to the method of karma points. Therefore, he had been working hard to maintain this system all these years. Zhang Yan said, "When I left that year, I promised the palace master that I would protect him. Before he returns, I'm afraid that everything will not be smooth. Elder Peng, you need to make some arrangements." Elder Peng's expression turned solemn. He knew what was important. If Zhang Yan came to say it personally, it would not be a simple matter. Perhaps the Yuhuan Heavens was going to face another crisis. He said, "Exalted Master Zhang, please tell me what you need the Green Jade Palace to do." Zhang Yan said, "The palace master has previously set up a base of formation outside the Yuhuan Heavens. I will make another arrangement on it. However, you need to take care of it. From now on, all the cultivators of the various realms must pass through the universal emptiness ring when traveling to and from the void space. No one is allowed to enter the void primordial sea privately." Elder Peng said without hesitation, "I understand. Apart from this, does the Exalted Master have any other instructions?" Zhang Yan, "Everything else is as usual." Elder Peng said, "I will pass down the instructions now." Zhang Yan then sent a strand of his consciousness down. He wandered around the Yuhuan Heavens for a while. Although his incarnation had swept through this place before, he still found some unusual and suspicious qi dynamics on a few fierce demons. This generation was not directly related to those demons, but it should be related to the qi dynamics that were wandering outside. Therefore, he casually destroyed it with a thought. Then, his gaze fell on the entire Yuluo tribe. If the qi dynamics of the various realms were combined, it could be seen that there was a forbidden formation that was not completely set up. This should be what Fu Qingming originally prepared to protect his own tribe. Previously, it had also blocked the attack of the void creatures. It must be something else that he would set up in the future. It was not good for him to interfere in this matter, but as the threat of the demons approached, since he had promised to protect them, he had to take matters into his own hands. Therefore, with a flick of his finger, an immeasurable amount of vitality surged up, and countless restrictions were formed on it. This formation completely isolated the inside and outside. It was not enough to protect the innate demon, but after the internal threat was cleared, it was impossible for him to sneak in like before. Elder Peng turned back not long after and said, "I have arranged it according to the Exalted Master's instructions." Zhang Yan threw out a jade talisman and said, If anything happens, you can use this talisman and I will sense it. Elder Pring took it, looked at it, and put it away carefully. Zhang Yan did not say anything else. With a wave of his sleeves, he walked out of the hall. As he took a step forward, everything around him gradually faded until it disappeared. In the next instant, he had already stepped onto the steps of the Green Sky Hall. With a thought, Jing Yu was waiting outside the hall, and there were more than 100 kinds of living beings that were not there before in the hall. In the Shenyuan tribe, there was no change in the various worlds, just like before. It was just that it was safe now, but if the demons were to escape, there would be no place that could be said to be safe. With another thought, he landed in front of the main hall of the floating heavenly palace and reflected his figure into the real world. The boy in front of the door suddenly felt it, and when he saw that it was him, he exclaimed and hurriedly bowed to the ground, saying, "Greetings, Hall Master Duzhen." "Zhang Yan, is the sect master spiritual master here?" The boy was about to speak, but his expression paused as if he was listening to something. Then he said, "The sect master spiritual master invites Hall Master Duzhen in." Zhang Yan nodded slightly and walked into the hall. Sect Master Qin was already in front of the steps to welcome him, so he bowed and said, "Greetings, Sect Master Spiritual Master." Sect Master Qin also bowed and said, "Greetings, Hall Master Duzhen." After the greetings, the two of them sat down. Zhang Yan exchanged a few pleasantries, then said, "Disciple has returned today for an important matter. Outside the heavens, a tribulation is about to descend. If we don't put an end to it in time, it might affect our mountain and sea realm." Sect Master Qin was calm when he heard this. After some thought, he said, "Hall Master Duzhen has long since entered the upper realm, and even you say it's a tribulation. Presumably, it's not something that ordinary cultivators can withstand." Zhang Yan said, "That's right. I've already made an agreement with several fellow Taoists. If we can survive this tribulation, then the heavens will be stable. If we can't, then humanity will perish, and there will be no place for us cultivators to live in peace." Sect Master Qin's expression turned solemn, and he asked, "Is the situation so dangerous?" Zhang Yan said, "I'm not exaggerating in the slightest. It's just that the opponent's divine ability isn't weak. It can examine the thoughts of living beings, and can see what's happening in the heavens. If we don't cultivate it to a certain level, it's highly likely that we'll be discovered, and then we'll be able to find out where the mountain and sea realm is. Therefore, I'm afraid I can't tell you the details." Sect Master Qin nodded slightly. Although Zhang Yan hadn't said it directly, it wasn't difficult for Sect Master Qin to deduce from his words that the opponent was most likely a demon, devil, or outsider. Furthermore, the fact that he was taking this matter so seriously, and even wanted to contact many fellow Taoists to fight together, clearly showed that the opponent was unprecedentedly powerful. Sect Master Qin thought about it for a moment, then asked, "Temple Master Duzhen, how do you think we should deal with this?" Zhang Yan said, "If the tribulation comes, the mountain and sea realm will be powerless to defend against it. The Patriarch once left a jade rock in the primal sea of the void, within which is an immortal's cave that he and his disciples used to live in. If one's cultivation reaches a certain level, they will be able to observe top-notch secret magics from within. Because disciple reached the true Yang realm, I inherited this immortal's cave. Unfortunately, because I wanted to protect the immortal's realm, I didn't bring it back with me. Now, I don't know if I'll be able to return safely, so I'll leave it in the hands of the sect. The Patriarch once lived there, so it'll be difficult for outsiders to find out. If we can't avoid the tribulation, then we'll have to move the sect here." Sect Master Qin asked, "When will the tribulation come?" Zhang Yan said, "If it's short, it'll be 30 years. If it's long, it'll be 100 years. Actually, the tribulation is also an opportunity. If we can get through it, then the situation will be completely different." He flicked his sleeve and rose to his feet. "Time is of the essence. Disciple needs to focus all of my attention on how to deal with the enemy, so I won't stay here any longer." Sect Master Qin also rose from his seat and solemnly said, "Temple Master Duzhen, please be careful. There's no need to worry about the sect." Zhang Yan nodded, then cupped his hands and walked out of the main hall. He sensed that his disciples were still in secluded meditation, so it wasn't time to meet them yet. He sent his will to the immortal's realm Kuan mansion. First, he communicated with Ying Zhao, telling him to teleport to the mountain and sea realm. Next, he came to the open space and began to search for a suitable place to study Taoist magic. Just as he was thinking about this, the thick fog in midair parted to reveal a cliff hanging in the air. Looking up, he saw an immortal's cave near the peak of the mountain. He immediately knew that this was the place he was looking for. With a thought, he stood on the cliff, took a step forward, and pushed open the door. Chapter 1683. Zhang Yan had just entered the abode when he felt a mysterious sensation envelop his body. It was as if he'd arrived at a place where the heavens and men were at peace. Not only was his vital energy lively, even the circulation of his divine decree had become carefree. Not only that, the scenery here was completely different from the cave he had seen before. There was no top or cover above him, and there was only nothingness around him. Below him was a piece of flat land, with the shape of latitude and longitude. Water full of vitality flowed in and out of the land, as if it was a painting. A loud golden river flowed from afar, extending all the way to his feet. Within it he could see countless fish dragons swimming and jumping. He could clearly see that this was not a living creature, but an accumulation of spiritual opportunity that caused the golden water to take shape and give birth to some spirituality. However, if there was no body to carry it, it would forever remain like this, and there would be no further changes. For living creatures to cultivate, they had to first be determined before they could seek for change. If they were uncertain, they would become impermanent, and then they would not be able to walk the path of foundation establishment. He glanced around for a bit, then stepped onto the golden river and followed the flow. Not long after, he saw a large platform in front of him. There was a 9-storied pagoda on top of it. Light shone in all directions from the pagoda. With one look, he knew that this was the place he was looking for seclusion. With a thought, he appeared in front of the pagoda in an instant. Then he waved his sleeves and walked up the jade stairs to the top of the pagoda. The place was spacious, and there were 16 large pillars in the surroundings. They did not look like gold or bronze, but wood or stone. It was unknown how deep they were rooted below. He took a few glances and realized that although these pillars looked simple, their effects were like the roots of the earth. They were constantly spreading spiritual vigor. Not far ahead was an incense burner. It was supported by 3 legs, and its belly was wide and round. There were countless golden pills that looked like stars spinning inside it, and they constantly emitted sparks. They guided the various types of qi in this place to move. He fell into deep thought. Everything here seemed to be displaying some sort of profound logic, as if responding to what he was thinking just now. Even though he was already the master of the Kuan manner, it seemed like there were still many things he didn't understand. However, now wasn't the time to be thinking about these things. He raised his head and saw a praying mat in the middle of the room. He walked over, spread his sleeves, and sat down. In just an instant, strands of thoughts floated past his mind, and the principles that he hadn't been able to figure out in the past seemed to have been dispelled and seen the sun, causing him to be suddenly enlightened. Moreover, some minor details that he'd overlooked in his Tao art in the past had surfaced from the depths of his mind, and even his senses seemed to have been magnified by a few times. He instantly knew that if nothing unexpected happened, then this meditation cushion was a treasure as well. Under such circumstances, an inexplicable feeling suddenly leapt into his mind. His expression changed slightly, but he didn't take it lightly. With a thought, a strand of his consciousness split out and instantly left the Kuan manor, heading towards the void. After that, he didn't care about anything else. He calmed his mind and sank into the jade remnant, beginning to deduce the divine ability and secret technique. After that strand of consciousness went outside, it shifted and arrived outside the Liheng world. At this moment, within the Liheng world, there were tens of thousands of demon cultivators drawing talisman and building altars. It could be seen that they were doing this to weaken the formation, but to him, this was a good thing. This meant that the demons hadn't discovered the abnormality within the formation. However, this didn't mean that they could be at ease. After 30 years, if the demons didn't do anything, then they could still fight for a period of time. However, if there were any changes in the formation at that time, it meant that the demons might know the truth. In order to avoid being passive, they had to kill their way in earlier. Just as he was observing, he felt an extremely faint fluctuation of spiritual vigor, as if it was guiding him. With a thought, he chased after it. In just a flash, he had already entered a dark and empty place. A young Taoist was sitting there. He had thick eyebrows and a long beard, and his eyes were clear and bright. When he saw him, he stood up and bowed, saying, "Fellow Taoist, you're here." Zhang Yan glanced at him and had already guessed his identity. He bowed back and said, "Are you fellow Taoist Huantong?" The Taoist said with a smile, "That's me. However, my main body has already turned into the forbidden formation here and no longer exists." Zhang Yan also understood that what he saw in front of him couldn't be considered Huantong's main body. It was just a strand of Huantong's remaining aura. It looked even weaker than Fu Qingming back then, and it didn't have any Weili. If it wasn't for his true yang cultivation, he could sense it. If it was a lower generation cultivator, they wouldn't be able to see it at all. He looked over and said, "A few days ago, the spatial concealment jade membrane flew over by itself. Was it your doing?" Huantong admitted, "It was indeed my doing. The last time you came here, I knew you were looking for the other half of the treasure. However, it wasn't the right time at that time, so I couldn't entrust it to you. Not long ago, I found a chance, so I sent it over." Zhang Yan said, "Originally, we could have calculated the time when the formation would dissolve, so we could deal with it. However, by doing this, it added a lot of variables." He didn't mention that he was going to deal with the demons because the person in front of him wasn't Huantong anymore. Moreover, this place was right before Bu Su Tian closed the gate, so it could be said that the Xiantian demon was very close. If he mentioned it rashly, it could be sensed by the Xiantian demon. Huantong sighed, "I have no choice but to do this." Zhang Yan's eyes flashed and said, "Did the demons make any movements?" Huantong replied, "That's right. Even though these demons don't know what's buried in the formation, they've guessed that there's a magic tool hidden there, so they're planning to capture the treasure after the formation is dissolved. After I noticed their actions, I thought it would be inappropriate to leave the treasure here, so I gave it away. Don't worry, fellow Taoist, I'll be using my divine will to guide the treasure while it's moving, so the demons definitely won't be able to detect it." Zhang Yan said, "I was just sitting and watching, but I suddenly sensed something, so I came here. I believe there must be a reason. Do you have something to say to I?" Huantong said, "When you came to find the spatial concealment jade membrane, I knew that you lacked a magic tool to control it. I might be able to help you with that." Zhang Yan was slightly surprised. "Could it be that you still have some magic tool left outside?" Huantong shook his head and said, "After the great change in Bu Su Heaven, I was already very lucky to be able to obtain the spatial concealment jade membrane. Moreover, in order to deal with those demons back then, I almost used everything I had. I brought everything that I needed, so how could I have any magic tools left? It's just that recently, the demons have been coming in and out frequently, which inadvertently revealed something. They seem to be looking for something. I guess that since they were so anxious, it should be useful to them, so I paid more attention to it. Not long after, I discovered that they were looking for the unfettered wood." Zhang Yan was slightly surprised and said, "The unfettered wood? Is it the one on Bu Su Heaven Ray Mountain?" Huantong said, "That's it." Zhang Yan raised his eyebrows. This giant tree was very famous. According to the records, it was one of the 3 giant trees that reached into the heavens in Bu Su Heaven. In particular, its branches were great treasures, and it was considered a rare item even in Bu Su Heaven. In particular, it was used to make spirit boats. If it was used for teleportation, almost no one would be able to track it. The other 2 giant trees that were as famous as it had been cut down long ago. Only this tree was preserved until the end because of its deep roots and luxuriant leaves. However, because it was cut down too much, it was also on the verge of collapse. Later on, some great figures of the human path were afraid that something would happen if this tree fell, so they forbade people from plucking it. He said, "Fellow Taoists said that the demons are looking for this thing. Could it be that it has wandered outside?" Huantong said, "According to what I've been paying attention for a long time, this giant tree seemed to have fallen after that great change. However, for some reason, it didn't stay in Busu heaven. Instead, it wandered into the void essence sea. A few days ago, these demons seemed to have discovered its whereabouts, so they wanted to find it with the help of the demon clan from beyond the heavens. If fellow Taoist has the chance, why don't you get it first? Whether it's to refine artifacts or to make spirit boats, it's fine. If it's really difficult to do so, you can try to prevent it from falling into the hands of the demons." Zhang Yan's mind changed. If this was true, then it was indeed an opportunity. It was difficult for those demons to come out with their true bodies. They could only send their clones outside, so they couldn't compete with them at all. In fact, even if he found the unfettered wood now, he might not have enough time to refine it. However, as Huantong said, even if he couldn't use it, he could still prevent the demons from growing stronger. He said, "Fellow Taoist, do you know where this thing went?" Huantong took out a ball of qi activity, opened his palm, and sent it forward. He said, "Fellow Taoist, if you follow this, you might be able to find it." Zhang Yan took the ball of qi activity and immediately calculated the direction of the demon clan. He looked up and said, "Fellow Taoist, thank you for telling me about this." Huantong sighed. "The restrictive formation is about to be broken. This is the only thing I can do." Zhang Yan thought for a moment and said, "I have something to ask. Fellow Taoist Huantong, how much do you know about the situation in Busu heaven now?" Huantong said apologetically, "So I do know a little. It's just that a lot of my memories involve too much karma. If I forcefully retain them, it would easily cause damage to the grand formation, so I severed them. Now, I don't know much more than you do." Zhang Yan nodded. He understood that he couldn't know more. He said, "I can't stay here any longer, so I'll bid you farewell." At this moment, Huantong said, "Fellow Taoist, please wait. May I know how my disciples are doing?" Zhang Yan said, "The cultivators of Mount Qingju are now in the I clan. As long as they aren't attacked by the demons, it won't be hard for their orthodoxy to continue." Huantong solemnly bowed and said, "I thank you. Mount Qingju owes you a favor. If I come back to life in the future, I will definitely repay you." Zhang Yan's heart moved. It seemed that Huantong had left some backup plans for him. However, for a true young cultivator to come back to life, the key was the item he needed to entrust. If there was any interference, the result would be hard to predict. It seemed that Fu Qingming had planned for a long time. If it wasn't for the arrangements made by Tai Ming Grandmaster, the demons would have destroyed his plan. Even now, there was still a possibility that he wouldn't be able to succeed. It was clear how dangerous it was. After this farewell, he might not be able to see this person again. Chapter 1684. After Zhang Yan bid farewell to Huantong, with a single thought, this incarnation had already appeared at the place where the wisp of demonic qi had gone to. This was a realm sky with weak spiritual vigor. Below it, the mountains had collapsed, the land was cracked, and water vapor rose. There were evaporated lakes and swamps everywhere. Between the scorched trees and rotten leaves, countless broken tiles and ruins could be seen. Only from the half-collapsed wall pillars, it could be seen that there should have been magnificent palaces everywhere. This place should have experienced a fierce battle not long ago. Just from the traces on the surface, it should have been within the last 10 years. He concentrated for a moment, and scenes of the past floated past his eyes. Immediately, he understood most of the situation here. This was originally a realm sky where the human path occupied the mainstream. Although the spiritual vigor was not flourishing, there were many people who knew the way of cultivation, and most of them were inclined towards the path of artifact forging. The cultivators here paid great attention to regulating the heaven and earth, adhering to the rule of taking one thing to make up for another. Although they took a lot from the heaven and earth, they were very restrained. If this continued, It would not be a big problem to maintain this for another million years. This generation used the limited external objects in their hands, but they could do all kinds of great things that exceeded their own abilities. Perhaps they had already realized that the spiritual vigor of the heaven and earth would completely disappear one day. Before the unforeseen event happened here, they found a piece of strange black wood from somewhere and prepared to use it to forge an artifact. Their goal was to break through the barrier of the realm of heaven and earth and travel beyond the void. Zhang Yan realized that he could not see the past of the big wood. It seemed that it was the unfettered wood. However, this object only looked to be tens of thousands of feet long. For the legendary heavenly wood, it was too short. Perhaps this one was only a part of it. Originally, if there were no unforeseen events, then the people of this realm would very likely not be restricted to this world. However, this hope was completely shattered after the arrival of tens of thousands of demons from beyond the sky. He noticed that the leader of the invading demons was a large demon wearing a horned helmet. His cultivation was around the 5th layer of the strength path. After destroying this place, he found the huge piece of wood and used some kind of magic tool to travel to another world. Only a few small demons remained. Because they were all demons that had just gained intelligence, they did not attract his attention at first. With a thought, these monsters all turned into dust. Then he grabbed a wisp of qi. Although the qi given by Huan Tong was only up to this point, he had already found a clue. As long as they did not return to Bu Su Tian, he could continue searching. After a short search, he found that he had gone to another realm sky. As soon as he arrived, he saw countless demons fighting some cultivators and some human cultivators. In this realm, it was clear that the cultivators of the human path coexisted with some other species. At this moment, they were working together to defend against the invasion of the demons. However, the cultivators here were much stronger than those in the void, and both sides were fighting back and forth. He knew very well that there was a reason for those demons to find this place. It was very likely that the remains of the unfettered wood were here. Thus, he swept his gaze around and quickly found something similar in an underground palace. There were layers of protection around it. It was clear that the people of this realm attached great importance to this item. At this moment, the demon leader wearing the horned helmet was holding a black leaf in his hand. He was riding a magic raft and flying in that direction. It was obvious that he was relying on this item to find the whereabouts of the target. This demon cultivator was very powerful. Although many cultivators came to stop him along the way, and even set up many formations, they were all broken through by him with his powerful body. It was almost as if he had entered a realm where no one could stop him. Zhang Yan was not in the mood to watch what happened next. When he focused his gaze, the demon's body stiffened and then collapsed. No matter how powerful it was, as long as it had not reached the true Yang realm, it was no different from an ant in front of him. After dealing with this demon, he guided with his mind and took the black leaf and the broken piece of wood from its body. The demons below sensed this and could not help but be shocked. They looked up and saw a black-robed Taoist standing in the sky. There seemed to be endless light flowing around his body, and even the light of the sun, moon, and stars was covered. They were all knowledgeable, and they all looked terrified. They said, "The incarnation of Yuan Zun?" All the demons that had invaded this realm lost their will to fight in an instant. They all fell from the sky and crouched there, trembling. Some of them even had their skulls split open by the magic treasures, but they did not dodge. This scene shocked the cultivators of this realm. At this moment, there was a floating island in the sky. On it stood 2 Taoists and a foreign species. Behind each of them stood many disciples and clansmen. They were the 3 people with the highest cultivation in this realm. Just now, it was because of their existence that they were not at a disadvantage in the battle against the demon. When they saw this, they were shocked. After a nervous discussion, they pushed out a green-robed Taoist and let him go to the sky to negotiate. After this person left the floating island, he went to the sky. What shocked him was that although he did not look far away, no matter how he walked, he could not get closer. Zhang Yan held the black leaf in his hand and sensed it for a moment. He felt that there was a similar qi dynamic in different realms. He nodded and kept the item. He looked down and saw a Taoist walking towards him. He used his divine art and moved the Taoist in front of him. The Taoist realized that he was close to him in an instant. He had no idea how he got up here. He could not help but secretly exclaim at this kind of divine art. He calmed his mind, put his palms together and bowed. He said, "Little Taoist Lai Ji greets great sage." Zhang Yan said, "Fellow Taoist Lai Ji is the person in charge here?" Lai Ji bowed and said, "Yes. Thanks to the favor of the fellow Taoists, I am the person in charge." At this moment, he could not feel any qi dynamic from Zhang Yan. It was as if the person standing in front of him was just an illusion. If he thought about it carefully, it was as if they were in different realms. There was no way to judge the realm of this person. And the more unpredictable it was, the more he was in awe. He took a deep breath and slowly raised his head. He tried to ask, "Great sage, are you here to hunt down those demons?" Zhang Yan shook his head and said, "They are not worth I doing this. I am here to take something." Lai Ji's heart shook. He said, "What does great sage need?" Zhang Yan did not hide and said directly, "The broken wood that fellow Taoist Lai Ji placed under the underground palace." Lai Ji hesitated and said, "So great sage is really talking about that divine wood?" Zhang Yan nodded and said, "This wood is called the unfettered wood. If it is used to forge treasures, it is quite useful. It is not wrong to call it the divine wood. Those demons are here for this. I will not allow this item to fall into the hands of these people, so I have come to take it. However, I will not take your item for free. I will naturally compensate you." In a short moment, Lai Ji had already made a decision. He said, "I dare not. If this item is left here, it will only bring more trouble to my generation. Great sage, please take it away. As for compensation..." He paused. "This is not something that belongs to us, and I dare not take it for myself." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "This item has no owner. Since it has fallen here, it is fated with you." He stretched out his hand and pointed. A talisman flew down. "I have observed the techniques of the world. At fellow Taoist's realm, it has reached its limit. There are 3 advanced techniques here. You can take it and read it." When Lai Ji heard this, he was pleasantly surprised and excited. No matter how mysterious the divine wood was, how could it compare to a technique that could guide one to the Tao? He bowed and repeatedly thanked Meng Hao. Zhang Yan had no intention of staying any longer. With a wave of his sleeve, he took the broken piece of wood, then turned and flew away. When Lai Ji looked up again, he found that there was nothing in front of him. Feeling disappointed and frustrated, he tightened the talisman in his sleeve and turned to flee. There were still many demons waiting for them to deal with. After leaving this world, Zhang Yan followed the aura on the leaf and searched. This time, he did not encounter any demons. Before long, he had found all the remaining pieces of wood. Originally, he should have taken the item back to the mountain and sea realm. However, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. Everything seemed to be going too smoothly, as if the unfettered wood were just waiting for him to take it. It wasn't that he had sensed something, but that something was wrong. As far as he was concerned, the unfettered wood was a rare and precious material, and yet they had given it to the demonic cultivators down below, instead of sending their clones to retrieve it. No matter how he looked at it, it seemed a bit reckless. Having reached this point in his train of thought, he flicked his sleeve, summoning the black leaf and the rest of the wood. After examining them closely, he finally found the problem. There was still a part of the unfettered wood that was missing. It wasn't a broken branch, but something similar to the black leaf. And it seemed to be pointing to Bu Shutian. His eyes flickered. This meant that if the demons still had something like this, they might be able to use it to find him and the mountain and sea realm. If he wasn't mistaken, then it was highly likely that the demons had deliberately set this up, with the goal of luring him into their trap. It was just that the plan was a bit crude, so he had found a flaw in it. Actually, that was normal. Khanate demons were born with incredible divine abilities. Other than almighty true yang cultivators, they could suppress everything with raw power. However, in the higher realm, they could divine the workings of heaven. When it came to scheming against the hearts of people, they weren't necessarily as accurate. Of course, in the true Yang realm, as long as they were careful with their calculations, they would be able to perform a flawless calculation. As long as they put their mind to it, they could even perform a flawless calculation. However, there was a problem. Because true eye cultivators plotted against each other, if one side performed too many calculations, then the other side would definitely be able to sense it. Even the workings of heaven couldn't be completely concealed. Therefore, when dealing with people of the same generation, it was usually best to be direct and direct. Repeated calculations would make it easier for the opponent to sense them. He snorted coldly. Although he had seen through everything, it was still a dangerous situation. Almighty cultivators could seek fortune and avoid calamity, but most of the time, they relied on their own intuition. Thankfully, he hadn't been in the true Yang realm for very long, so he didn't rely entirely on intuition. Instead, he relied on whether or not his intuition was reasonable. If he wasn't careful, then he really might fall into a trap. Chapter 1685. From this, Zhang Yan could tell that the demons and devils weren't willing to just sit around and wait. Not only were they paying attention to what was happening outside, but they were also occasionally resorting to some sort of countermeasure. Things weren't going smoothly, and he had to be careful of them continuing to cause trouble in the shadows. He had been cautious this time, and had been able to detect it ahead of time. But if it happened again, he might not be able to avoid it. Now that he thought about it, if he hadn't been able to detect it, it wouldn't have been just the mountain and sea realm that would have been exposed. He might have even been exposed to places he had been to, such as Dan Yi's nameless realm, or the hiding place of Emotsong and the others. But now that he had detected it, he wasn't going to let them have their way. He looked at the broken pieces of wood. They had been delivered to him, and he wasn't going to refuse them. He was going to figure out a way to make use of them. With a thought, he appeared in the middle of a desolate world. He tossed out the unfettered wood, which floated in front of him. Just now, although he had discovered some problems with it, he couldn't guarantee that it wasn't a trap within a trap. He still needed to be careful. After all, he was only an incarnation, and there were some things that he might not be able to see through. Furthermore, this place had nothing to do with where he had been before, so even if the demons and devils found this place, they wouldn't be able to do anything. Only by severing the connection between the unfettered wood and Bushutian would he be able to use it. The best way to do that would be to send it into the elephant dragon gold furnace and refine it into a magical item. Then it would be useless, as it would become something else, and the karma of the past would be severed. However, the furnace was still in the hands of Dan Yi and Emotsong. He would have to wait until they finished refining it before he could take it back. Based on his calculations, it wouldn't take many years, and he should be able to make it in time. After thinking about it for a moment, he sat down. Inside of Bushutian, several consciousnesses were communicating with each other. The unfettered wood wasn't taken to the place it was supposed to go. It's just been left somewhere. It seems our plan has been seen through. It's a small change, but it won't affect the overall situation. The restrictive spell formation is about to be undone, and it won't be long before we leave. When the time comes, we can resolve the karma. If the human Tao doesn't perish, then it would be difficult for me to become the ruler of this world. Now that the opportunity is before me, I can replace it. After exchanging a few more words, the several consciousnesses quickly dispersed. In the mountain and sea realm, the Jade Kuan, Inge, had already arrived at the realm gate on Zhang Yan's orders. However, he did not enter the realm gate. Instead, just like in the Shenhong heaven, he created a half-world for himself to reside in. Ingue sensed it and leaped up from the void sea. It circled around the Kuan in an extremely intimate manner. Its body was huge, but in front of the Kuan, it was like a child. For beams of clear light flashed in front of the world gate as sect leader Qin led Mengjida, Qi Yuntian, and Shen Baishuang out of the mountain and sea realm and into this half-world. Shen Baishuang looked at Yukuan and said, "The cave abode left behind by the patriarch is in this fellow Taoist's body?" Sect leader Qin looked at the Kuan and said slowly, "This is not only the cave abode of the patriarch, but also a place where the disciples of our Qinsong hide from the tribulation. He had already informed the Reverend Mortal Metamorphosis of what Zhang Yan had told him. However, that was all. Because this matter was too important, it was not appropriate to spread the news before the preparations were completed. Sect leader Qin ordered the three of them to stay here while he went forward. He cupped his hands and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoist Ing Zhao." Ing Zhao pacified Ing Ge, who was playing around, and replied in a serious tone, "Greetings, sect leader Qinsong. The Shenyuan Exalted has already given me instructions. I will need to listen to the arrangements of the Exalted Ones." Sect leader Qin said, "Please open the door, fellow Taoist. These disciples and I would like to enter the cave abode of the Patriarch to take a look." Yu Kuan agreed. A ray of spiritual light was released from his body, and a rainbow road was instantly laid out. Sect leader Qin waved his horsetail whisk and stepped on the rainbow light with the three of them. After a short while, they appeared in a vast sky region. There were floating cliffs everywhere, and clouds and mist shrouded the place. Spiritual vigor flowed like light. He looked at the scenery in front of him and said, "Hall Master Duzhen once said that this place is mystical. Everyone has their own opportunities. If we were to stay together, we would be hindering each other. Let's split up." The three of them cupped their hands and went their separate ways. After Shen Baishuang bid farewell to the others, he randomly chose a direction and walked. However, after a few steps, he could not feel the aura of the others. However, with this thought in his mind, he faintly felt something and instantly understood. There was nothing fixed here, and there was no direction or distance. As long as there was a thought in his mind, all kinds of things would appear at will. Since that was the case, he did not think too much about it. He just wanted to find a place that would be helpful to his cultivation. In an instant, the scenery outside changed. The original hazy image became clear. Not far away, there was a tall yellow cliff. The clouds above were dyed gold, and the water at the bottom was emerald blue. Although it was ethereal, it did not lose its magnificence. In a flash, he had already entered an empty cave in the cliff. The surrounding copper shelves in the cave were filled with ancient books and jade scrolls. He walked to the side and randomly picked up a scroll to open. He realized that it recorded secret techniques that he had never seen before. From the looks of it, the original techniques of Qinsong school were of the same origin. It was not difficult to understand. He raised his head again and saw that all the items placed here were similar to him. However, after thinking about it, he only stood at the same spot and did not go to other places to look. As the person who guarded the golden pavilion, he was very clear that sometimes knowing too much might not be a good thing. It was very likely to cause one to be at a loss of what to do. If one were to be greedy and seek perfection, it would instead disturb one's own cultivation. As soon as he thought of this, 99% of the books that he had seen before were gone. Only a few books were left on the shelves. Seeing this scene, he immediately understood that this was not only an opportunity, but also a test of the heart. If he had any wild thoughts just now, he might have sunk into it and dragged down his cultivation. However, his will was strong and there was no lingering fear in his heart. He was calm. He randomly found an empty space to sit down and try to understand the secret techniques recorded in the jade scrolls. At the same time, the people who entered the cave residence this time also found their own fates and stopped to cultivate. Although there was no one in charge of the Qinsong school, when they came out, the daily affairs had already been taken care of, so there was no chaos. Zhang Yan's incarnation stayed in the deserted world for 10 years. Until one day, he suddenly felt something and saw a stream of light. The elephant dragon golden furnace flew over and landed at his feet. He knew that Dan Yi and the others had finished using it and sent it back to him. He thought for a while. This item was originally a miracle of creation. If he changed it and used it purely as a treasure, it would be a waste of such a miracle. He should bring out its true nature. There were 3 great heaven-supporting trees in Busha Heaven, Wujiu, Wuang, and Wuji. They each had their own uses. The guiltless wood was able to harmonize the spiritual vigor, and it could make all living things flow smoothly. The ancient cultivators all liked to break off a branch and store it in their cave abode. After refining this item, They could even place it in the Sea of Vitality to make the circulation of vitality smoother. The Wuang wood could calm the heart and mind, suppress the demons in one's heart, and prevent evil. If a true yang cultivator could not use the heartless technique, he only needed to take a piece and refine it to calm his chaotic thoughts. It was also very useful for incarnations. As for the unfettered wood, it was known to be unaffected by external causes and could avoid all techniques. If a cultivator obtained it, he could use it as a house and travel anywhere he wanted. He would not be suppressed and restrained. Among the 3 trees, the unfettered wood did not have a fixed residence. It could suddenly enter the sky and suddenly enter the ground. That was how it was able to avoid being destroyed early. It was only when it was taken care of that it stopped running around. However, under the great change of the sky, it was difficult to escape. From Zhang Yan's point of view, no matter what you are, as long as you exist in this world, you must be bound by the laws of the world. As long as you enjoy great benefits, there will be a tribulation. You can either face it head-on or find a way to eliminate it. How could you avoid it every time? The unfettered wood did not actually avoid the tribulation. It merely delayed it. However, with the accumulation of cause and effect, it would eventually come true. For example, true yang cultivators also had internal conflicts. This was actually a way to follow the laws of the world and protect oneself. Of course, if you had enough strength to resist the tribulation or had a way to avoid it, then you wouldn't have to care about this. However, most cultivators didn't have this ability. The tree had been able to escape the change in Busu's world, but this was not necessarily a bad thing for it. If it had not experienced this, with its actions and the countless karmic entanglements, it would have blocked all its paths to survival. It would have died, but now there was still a remnant of it left. After thinking about it, he decided not to make too many changes. It was best to chisel it into a spirit boat. In fact, he had an advantage here. There were many discussions about how to refine this item. These were all recorded in ancient books, and there were many detailed steps. Since there was wisdom from the predecessors, there was no need for him to make further deductions. He only needed to make some slight changes. Because he couldn't obtain some of the precious materials in Busha Heaven, he could only replace them with suitable materials. Although the effect would be reduced, there was nothing he could do about it. However, just as he was about to start refining it, he paused and smiled. So you're not being honest. Since there are still some here, I'll use it. However, he noticed that there was still a small amount of mystical chi left in the elephant dragon golden furnace. It should have been extra when refining the golden lotus last time, and it had secretly taken it. This thing was a good thing. True yang cultivators had the ability to achieve anything they wanted. However, the items in Busu Heaven might not be able to be completely restored, but with this strange chi, they could be restored to their original state. This way, he would be able to find the precious materials that he lacked. The elephant dragon golden furnace sent a thought to him, seemingly very unwilling. Zhang Yan smiled and said, "This time, I'm borrowing it from you. Don't be anxious. If you survive this calamity, I'll naturally find something good for you in the future. Furthermore, you and I can be considered to be in the same boat. If we fail to vanquish the demons this time, in the end, we'll just be benefiting this generation." Although the elephant dragon golden furnace was still a little reluctant, it could still distinguish the pros and cons. As soon as the furnace lid was opened, it released all the remaining mystical chi. Zhang Yan smiled. With a thought, all the remnants of the unfettered wood were thrown into the furnace. Chapter 1686. Zhang Yan placed the unfettered wood into the cauldron, and at the same time he visualized. As the strange qi dispersed, the treasures that originally existed in Busu Tian gradually formed and fell into the cauldron following the refinement process. The elephant dragon gold cauldron was also constantly buzzing, and there was a mist rising from it. But not long after, the object emitted a sense of joy. This was because if he could refine something of high quality, it would also be beneficial for perfecting himself. However, The unfettered wood was one of the 3 heaven-supporting trees in Bu Su Tian. Even though it was damaged, its original self had not changed. It was definitely not something that ordinary treasures could compare to. If he really put the whole piece of divine wood in, perhaps the golden cauldron might not be able to withstand it. The current situation was the best. However, after all, it was a divine wood, and the refinement time was far longer than ordinary treasures. After refining for more than 10 years, there was only a slight movement. The sound of emptiness came from within the cauldron, like the beating of a drum. The broken wood also produced a strange change. It actually melted like ice and gathered in one place. On the surface, it looked like it had turned into a ball of flowing water, as if it could change at will. However, this was not the case. The ancient records had long stated that at this stage, the refiner only had a moment to reconstruct it. If he failed, no matter how he fiddled with it, it would still return to its original state, and all the effort would be in vain. If he wanted to do this again, it was only a small matter to waste the treasures again. The more difficult problem was that it would be even more difficult to refine than the last time. This object seemed to be able to adapt to the changes in the outside world. If he failed every time, it would only become more and more difficult until he could no longer refine it. From this point of view, after this object had experienced a great calamity, there was a certain chance that it could avoid the same calamity in the future. He tried to deduce it in the divine will, but no matter how many times he tried, he did not succeed once. This was just as the ancestors' legacy had said. When it came to refining a strange object of this level, it could not be obtained through visualization. He could only rely purely on his own ability to sense the opportunity. If he missed it, it meant that they were not fated and he could not force it. He smiled faintly. Perhaps he could let nature take its course under normal circumstances, but at this juncture he could not consider whether it was fated or not. He could only try to force it. This might cause the treasure to be out of harmony with its master after it was completed, but it was better than not being able to use it. Looking at the broken wood turning in the cauldron, he said, "If the refinement fails, to prevent the demons from obtaining it, I will have to refine it to a place where no one can use it, and then bury it." The unfettered wood had been in the cauldron for more than 10 years. Although it had not completed the refinement, it had developed a trace of spirituality. This was unavoidable. Of this unfettered wood. Divine time on and spirit time, and was wood had as. And it and wood. When Zhang Yan saw this, he raised his eyebrows. There were no records of such a situation in the ancient books. But speaking of which, in the past, those of his kind could only refine a branch at most. Later on, when the divine wood was guarded, they could only take a tiny branch or leaf. How could they be as extravagant as he was? He had gathered almost all the remaining branches, so it was normal for there to be a difference. But from this, he also thought that since those demons were willing to use this item as bait, they must have something even better in their hands. That was why they were at ease and threw it outside. It seemed that the battle against the demons would be even more difficult and dangerous than what he had originally estimated. He calmed his mind and sent out his will. In an instant, the unfettered wood that had transformed into flowing water began to move like a whirlpool. As it turned, it gradually changed into the form he visualized. But at this moment, it began to struggle, as if it was resisting. But the will told him that this was not its original intention. Zhang Yan narrowed his eyes. This situation was a little strange, as if there was an indescribable force that was suppressing it from changing. He had already guessed that this was most likely the means of the Khanate demons, and their goal was probably to prevent this item from being refined by others. He thought to himself, there really is a hidden trick, but nothing can escape from this furnace. This was not a place that his incarnation could resist. Immediately, his will moved and connected with his original body. Suddenly, a vast wave of yuan qi descended from the sky and entered the spirit boat. In an instant, it expelled the foreign force. After a few breaths, the yuan qi was retracted. This time, the obstruction was gone, and his will also became smooth. Soon, it turned into the shape of a long shuttle. Only in appearance, it looked a little similar to the skyscraping spirit boat that he used. Not long after, it was gradually enveloped by a layer of white fog. After a few more years, the golden furnace kept shaking as if it was about to rush out. Zhang Yan had been waiting outside. Now that he saw this scene, he knew that he was about to succeed. However, at this moment, he had only refined this spirit boat. The relationship between them had not been established yet, so he still had to go one step further and make this item completely belong to him. That was why before it was about to come out, he transferred a wisp of aura into it. After a while, the golden furnace quietened down. At this moment he saw a scene. In the boundless darkness, a wisp of aura was born and continued to grow until it turned into a towering tree. Suddenly, everything shattered and returned to nothingness. He understood that at this moment, this item had severed its original karma, washed away the past, and obtained a new life. Thus, he waved his sleeve and the lid of the furnace was lifted. With a loud noise, a flawless spiritual boat flew out with mystic light. When it first appeared, it was only about 3 meters long, but in the next moment, it grew to tens of thousands of meters long. This wasn't a transformation through a divine power, it was a true growth. However, it ignored all the processes. It seemed that once there was a cause, the result could be achieved in an instant. He waved his hand, and the spirit boat swayed and became about a foot long, just right to be held in his palm. After a brief inspection, he understood the ability of this item. Once it flew, it could travel through the world and land without a name. It did not exist in any place. Even if it was found by a supreme being with a will, it would go to a place that was opposite to it. As long as all the paths of survival were not cut off, it could not be stopped. It was not impossible for a true young cultivator to do this. It might take 1,000,000 years or even longer, but at that time, there might be new changes in the world. Therefore, if he simply wanted to avoid the tribulation, he could simply ride the spirit boat and avoid it. However, that didn't mean much to him. After all, if he wanted to avoid it, he could accept the invitation of Mo Tsang and the others, and hide in the realm space, or simply go to the Scarlet Continent. He was thinking about using the spirit boat in battle, and using its ability to evade all sorts of magic, he could avoid the precious treasures of the demons. In fact, if he couldn't defeat the demons in battle, then he could send the spirit boat to the mountain and sea realm. That way, the sect and the cultivators of the 9 continents would be able to avoid the tribulation, and then wait for the Tao to rise again. Having reached this point in his train of thought, he looked up at the spirit boat and said in a clear voice, "I'm not using you to avoid the tribulation, but to win. Today, I shall name you Fighting Victory." As soon as he said this, a burst of light shined from the boat, and it disappeared from his hand in a flash. At the same time, above the sea of vital energy, Zhang Yan's expression flickered. Within the divine will, a spirit boat had already appeared. It seemed that with a single thought, he could summon it out at any time. Zhang Yan nodded slightly. Unknowingly, he had already deduced for over 20 years here, and he had gained quite a bit in these past few days. Using the ancestral founder's technique as a foundation, coupled with the comprehension he obtained from the exchanges of others, he had sorted out a total of 3 secret techniques. One of them was used for defense, and the other 2 were completely used to destroy enemies. Although it seemed like everything was going smoothly, it didn't necessarily mean that he would succeed. After all, he still knew nothing about the treasures of the demons, and it was difficult to know whether or not he could fight them. Therefore, he had left a lot of leeway. As long as he knew what he had overlooked, he could make up for it at any time. It was just that when it came to a true battle, there would not be many opportunities for him to do so. However, now that he had the victorious heavenly vessel, he could do as he wished. If things did not go smoothly with this foundation that he had built beforehand, he could still make some deductions during the battle. Because he wouldn't be able to obtain any more benefits even if he continued cultivating, a strand of his consciousness descended, and he had already appeared in a world sky. Dan E and Michihito Ichido both had clones here, and they had been here for a long time. Seeing him arrive, they both stood up and bowed. "Greetings, fellow Zhang." Zhang Yan returned the greeting. After exchanging a few words, he turned his gaze to the Li Heng world sky. There were only a few years left until the 30-year deadline. If there were any abnormalities in the formation, they would have to charge in ahead of time. Michihito Ichito held the disc in his hand, but he didn't perform any more simulations. If he paid too much attention to it, the demons would instead notice something was wrong. As they waited, a few years flew by, but there were no changes in the chi activity in the world sky. Danny relaxed slightly and said, "Looks like that demon isn't in the mood to come out yet. We can still make some preparations." Michihito Ichito said, "Even though we've lost this barrier, it might come out at any time in the next few decades. We have to keep an eye on it." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. It was just a clone keeping an eye on it, so it wasn't anything difficult. Michihito Ichito said, "I think it's better to act as soon as possible. If that demon charges out on its own, it means that it's already prepared for everything. That's disadvantageous to me as well." Zhang Yan understood what he meant. That was the right thing to do. Because as they obtained the fortuitous encounters everywhere, their strength wouldn't increase significantly. The later they acted, the greater the chance of them losing. Dan E pondered for a moment and said, "I haven't been able to control the Golden Lotus freely. I still need some time." Zhang Yan sensed for a moment and said, "That fellow Taoist I mentioned is about to come back to life. In the end, this is a matter between the four of us. Why don't we wait for him to come back before we decide?" Chapter 1687. Dan E and Michihito Ichito also felt that although they had not met the last person, they could not ignore his opinion. So after a discussion, the three of them decided to continue making their own preparations and wait for Fu Qingming to come back to life before discussing the matter in detail. Zhang Yan left this incarnation here to keep an eye on the Li Heng world. At the same time, a wisp of consciousness instantly landed in the Yuhuan world. Elder Peng followed his instructions and isolated the inside from the outside. These 30 years could be said to be very peaceful. Because of the world ring, the method of karma points had already spread throughout the upper and lower worlds, and there was no place that it could not reach. Also because of this, some kind of change was quietly happening here. Zhang Yan could feel that something was about to surge out and replace something that originally existed in the world. Regarding the art of revival, the ancient books that he read actually did not have many records. They only talked about how to do it and what kind of divine powers and abilities there were. Everything else was only briefly mentioned and did not go into depth. He guessed that it was very likely that the true young cultivator who recorded these books was afraid that he would have to use this method one day. If the details were known by others, it was very likely that he would be secretly plotted against, so only a rough outline was written. However, it could also be a conventional taboo. Now that he was watching here, he more or less understood the crux of it. Even if the Dharmakaya of a true young cultivator was destroyed, the original primordial chi sea that was opened would not immediately collapse, because it did not exist in reality. As long as the trace of past cause or the remnant chi activity was not destroyed, it still existed. Although it could not be used again, if a way of retreat was arranged in advance, when it came back to life, it could still be communicated again. Unless the spirit was truly destroyed and the chi activity was completely lost, it was actually not very difficult to achieve such a thing, as long as the enemy was completely killed. Back then, Fu Qingming was prepared for death and had already set up many backup plans. Moreover, the Khanate demon was later blocked by the Great Universal Formation. If Bu Xiutian did not come out, he would not be able to achieve such a thing. After waiting for half a year above the Qinghua sky, Zhang Yan suddenly seemed to have noticed something. He released his consciousness and saw that there was boundless clear qi gathering in the Yuhuan world. All the spiritual vigor was like waves in the sea, surging and faintly gathering in one place. If there was no mistake, Fu Qingming was about to come back to life. The qi activity gathering was not for his own use, but for the Wei to reappear in the world. The primordial qi fluctuated and naturally stirred the spiritual vigor of the myriad world. At the same time, all the cultivators in the Yuhuan world sensed the abnormality. However, they didn't know what was going on and thought that it was an invasion. After all, the battle with the fiends had just ended not too long ago. Zhang Yan thought for a while, and with a shake of his body, he appeared in the golden hall of the Cloud Continent. Elder Peng was standing on the high platform of the hall, his face extremely solemn. He was observing the situation of the various worlds through the mirror. Because there was no sign of the turbulence in the aura, he only noticed it just now. At this moment, he had already ordered the people below to activate the formations and restrictions, and ordered the cultivators of the various heavens to be careful. But in his heart, he had a feeling that such a phenomenon was not a bad thing. At this moment, he suddenly felt something strange. He turned his head and saw Zhang Yan walking in from outside the hall. He couldn't help but reveal a look of joy. He hurriedly came down from the platform and bowed. Is the Overlord here because of this spiritual vigor fluctuation? Zhang Yan nodded. Yes. Elder Peng asked carefully, may I ask the Overlord, what is the cause of this spiritual vigor fluctuation? Zhang Yan smiled and said, you don't have to worry. This is because the palace master of your sect is about to return. It will calm down in a while. Elder Peng was surprised and delighted. The palace master is back? Zhang Yan smiled and nodded. Elder Peng suppressed the excitement in his heart and lowered his head, saying, this is a big matter. As the disciples of the sect, we should prepare a good welcome ceremony. However, Zhang Yan stopped him and said, hold on, the reason why the palace master left that year was to deal with the external enemies. I think that this is not a good time to announce it. Let's wait for the palace master to return before making a decision. Elder Peng knew that he had lost his composure. He calmed himself down and bowed. What the Overlord said is right. At this moment, Zhang Yan's heart skipped a beat. His consciousness turned and his figure disappeared from the hall. In an instant he appeared above the blue sky. He looked up and saw a young Taoist standing in the air, looking at the mountains and rivers below. The latter noticed his arrival and smiled, saying, Taoist Zhang is here. Zhang Yan sensed that his vitality had recovered. Just as he expected, he had once again connected with the sea of vitality. His Dharmakaya was now based on the system of karma points. This did not depend on how many places were using this method, but as long as there was a place where the method was being used from top to bottom, then it would not perish. However, since he was resurrected, the amount of vitality that he could use was less than his previous self. Once the consumption exceeded the limit of his body, he would lose all his supernatural powers. He could only wait for his vitality to recover before he could return to his original state. However, there was an advantage to this. As long as the method of karma points was not broken, the external method would not be able to harm him. Hence, as long as the demons did not find out where he was, he could continue to tangle with the enemy. He raised his hand with a smile and bowed, saying, Congratulations on becoming a Taoist. Fu Qingming returned the bow and sighed. Most of the memories of the past no longer exist. Now that I have a new life, it is time to start all over again. At this point he smiled again. When I am cultivating, my consciousness still exists between heaven and earth, so I can still sense some things. I still have to thank you for taking care of my disciples during this period of time. Zhang Yan smiled and said, This is what I promised you. At this moment, Fu Qingming seemed to sense something. He looked in one direction and his expression became slightly serious. He said, Taoist Zhang, did something happen to Bu Shutian? Zhang Yan also looked in that direction and said, Taoist Zhang, many things have happened while you were still alive. Fu Qingming's expression became solemn. He said, Please tell me. Zhang Yan said, You were the one who told me about Bu Shutian being occupied by the demons. However, you have cut off many of your memories, so there are many things that you did not tell me. Later on, I met a fellow Taoist, and just now I know the gist of it. As soon as he came down, he gave a rough account of the situation and didn't hide any of the details. When Fu Qingming heard that, he fell into deep thought. After a while, he said, In other words, now that the treasure that suppresses the array has flown out, the restriction array has lost most of its restraining power. If the Khanate fiendish demons discover any abnormalities, they can break out of the restriction at any time? Zhang Yan said, Exactly. Those two Taoists and I have decided to take back Bu Shutian. What do you think? Without any hesitation, Fu Qingming replied, "This matter concerns the rise and fall of humanity. I will naturally go with you." Zhang Yan was not surprised. He knew that Fu Qingming would definitely agree. This was not only because he had made this choice in the past, but also because the latter was different from others. His Whaley life was completely dependent on the good deeds method. Although he was almost invincible, if he lost his foundation, everything would become meaningless in the end. Thus, he had no other choice. Fu Qingming said, "Where are those two Taoists now?" Zhang Yan smiled. "Aren't you going to comfort your disciples first?" Fu Qingming shook his head. "We can talk about this after we return." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Friend, please follow me." With a flick of his sleeve, his profound energy surged in an instant, and a 5-colored boundary was formed. A path was instantly opened up in front of him, and he took another step into it. Fu Qingming followed right behind him. In a flash, the two arrived at a dark place. But in the next moment, a golden light spread out, and a world appeared. Michihito Ichito, who was wearing a green robe, floated over. He looked at Fu Qingming and sighed. "So it is Taoist Fu. I have long guessed that the person Taoist Zhang was talking about was you." Speaking up to this point, he seemed to know that Fu Qingming had just come back to life, so he probably didn't know many things in the past, so he said, "I'm Ian Jing. I've had some dealings with you before." Fu Qingming bowed. "I have forgotten most of the things of the past. If I have been rude, I hope you will forgive me." Michihito Ichito smiled. "You are too polite, Taoist." He paused for a moment and said, "Taoist Dan Yi is refining the golden lotus in a certain world. Since Taoist Fu is here, the four of us have gathered. Why don't we decide on the day to go to Busha Heaven? What do you think?" Zhang Yan came here with this intention, so he had no objections. Fu Qingming pondered for a moment and agreed. Taoist Yi flicked his sleeve, and the three of them instantly appeared on top of a magic tower. This place could accommodate mountains and lakes, and there were countless strange spirit birds flying around in the sky. The mountains were rich in color, and the thick clouds lingered in the sky, making the place look like ink. Dan Yi was sitting cross-legged on the side of a green lake that was as smooth as a mirror. The golden lotus was closing its petals under his control. But looking at his expression, it seemed that there was something that he had not seen through. He immediately noticed the arrival of the three of them, and he slowly withdrew the stem and leaf of the golden lotus into his body before he stood up and turned around. Fu Qingming took a step forward and cupped his hands as he said, "Are you Taoist Danny? Greetings." Danny put his palms together and bowed solemnly, and then he said seriously, "All those years ago, you covered for fellow Taoist Huantong, and that was why he had the chance to set up the formation. If it wasn't for the two of you, I'm afraid the Tao of Tao would have been annihilated a long time ago." Fu Qingming replied, "Even though I have forgotten what happened all those years ago, I can't help but feel regretful when I find out about it. I came here today because I intend to finish the unfinished business with the three of you." Dan Yi nodded repeatedly and said yes. He glanced at the three of them and said, "In this way, we can decide on the date of the expedition today." Michihito Ichito said, "It looks like you haven't completely mastered the golden lotus?" Danny waved his hand and said, "It's fine. I've already grasped the key point, and I'll be able to master it in a few more months." Michihito Ichito looked at Fu Qingming and said, "Fellow Taoist Fu, you've just now returned. Do you have a suitable artifact with you?" Fu Qingming pondered for a moment and said, "All the artifacts that I usually use are in Busha Heaven, but I've already set up some backup plans. Besides, even without these artifacts, as long as I'm still here, they won't be able to harm me. I can go with you to conquer the demons at any time and take back the Tao of Tao of Tao." You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.